Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere cold. And I don't mean grab a hoodie cold, I mean flesh freezing, bone brittle, 30 degrees, slap you in the face kind of cold. You're in a medieval European village right on the edge of survival. The wind whips sideways, snow drifts like ghosts through the gaps in thatch roofs, and there's not a scrap of firewood left in sight. You're not walking into a cosy tavern with a roaring hearth here. No. You're walking into a place where warmth is a luxury few can afford, and where the most valuable thing in town might just be a pile of dried cow poop. Yeah. Welcome to the Dark Ages, my friend. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, and what time it is over there. Are you curled up under a blanket while peasants here are sleeping next to livestock for body heat? Jealous. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your boots crunch on a thin layer of ice as you step into the village of Hrothford. It's not on any modern map, too small, too forgotten, but in the year 1316, it's home to just under 90 souls, give or take a few lost to disease or hunger last week. The houses are packed close, their wattle and daub walls sagging inward under the weight of winter snow. Thin trails of smoke drift upward from the chimneys, but not one smells like a forest fire. No pine, no birch, no oak. Just a strange, musty, almost meaty scent that makes your stomach twist. A child runs past you barefoot, his feet blue with cold, dragging a wooden cart filled with what looks like clumps of, yep, that's definitely dung. Frozen solid. He whistles while he works, face cracked with frostbite. You shiver. You don't belong here. Not really. But you're here anyway, embedded in this harsh winter, and now your job is simple. Survive it. Inside one of the homes, a woman named Elsbeth crouches beside the hearth, fanning a pathetic flame. The fuel? Not wood, not coal, but dried patties of cow dung she collected in warmer months, and laid out in the sun to cure. You crouch beside her, pretending this is totally normal, because here it is. In fact, dung is everything. Without it, you'd freeze to death before nightfall. Elsbeth is wrapped in 3 layers of wool, all of it hand-spun and dyed with crushed roots. The colour's long gone, but the warmth remains, barely. Her fingers are red and raw, nails split and bleeding. She doesn't seem to notice. She's focused entirely on keeping the fire going, poking at it with a blackened iron rod. When she speaks, her breath fogs in the air. "Wood's for lords," she says. "We burn what we have." And what they have is waste. Lots of it. The village livestock, cows, goats, a few pigs, produce a steady stream of the stuff. Collecting it isn't glamorous, but it's vital. You help a boy named Alric gather some near the barn. He teaches you how to tell the difference between good dry dung and the stuff that's still a bit fresh. Apparently the dry ones burn longer. Who knew? Later you try breaking apart a frozen dung patty with your bare hands. It's like splitting a stale cookie made of misery. The cold seeps into your joints, and it hits you. People here are fighting a battle against the elements every single day. No thermostats, no electric blankets, just poop and grit. The thing is, this dung economy is surprisingly structured. Families with more livestock produce more fuel. They trade surplus for bread, or salt, or wool scraps. There's even a small black market. Alric whispers about an old man who mixes straw into his patties to bulk them up. A scammer. Even in the 14th century, people will cut corners to make a profit. Here's the historical bit. During times like the Great Famine, 1315, 1317, weather patterns shifted dramatically. Cold rains drowned crops, and winters stretched out like a punishment from the gods. Wood became more scarce, especially in overlogged areas. Royal forests were off limits to peasants. Getting caught gathering firewood could mean a hefty fine or worse. So, people adapted. They turned to what was available. And dung? Well, that was everywhere. Not everyone agrees on how widespread dung burning really was. Some historians argue it was mostly used in treeless regions, like parts of Ireland or the Netherlands. Others say it was common across large swathes of Europe, especially during environmental crises. It's one of those debates where the evidence is patchy, literally. Archaeologists find charred remains of animal waste in hearths, but how often it was used versus how often it had to be used, that's still up in the frosty air. One lesser-known twist. In some remote mountain communities, people also used human waste as fuel. That's right. Mixed with straw or moss, dried thoroughly in the sun, and we do mean thoroughly, it could sustain a small fire for cooking or warmth. Not popular, not ideal, but in survival, dignity is often the first thing you burn. Back in Elsbeth's house, the fire has finally caught. The room glows a faint flickering amber, and you can almost pretend it's warm. Almost. You eat a thin porridge of barley and turnip, there's no meat. Not in winter. Not unless you're willing to eat rats. Which, to be fair, some villagers are. As night settles in, the wind howls through the cracks in the walls. You curl up under a straw mattress next to the hearth, smoke curling above you. You smell like ash and manure. You're sore, tired, and deeply, viscerally cold. But you're alive, and in medieval Hrothford that's a pretty good start. Morning doesn't arrive with sunshine here. It creeps in, grey and sluggish, like it's just as reluctant to get out of bed as you are. Your breath still clouds the air, and when you sit up, a thin layer of frost dusts your blanket. Technically, you slept indoors. Realistically, you might as well have been outside. Elsbeth's fire has long since gone out, and the hearth is cold. Again. Because unlike a forest, dung doesn't grow on trees, and the day's supply has already been burned through the night. You step outside, wincing as icy air bites your face. The village looks like someone hit pause on suffering. Everything is still, brittle and frozen. Smoke rises from only a few chimneys. Most families have nothing to burn this morning. You pass a house with no roof, collapsed under snow a week ago. No one's fixing it. The family just moved in with neighbours, bodies stacked like firewood to conserve warmth. You glance toward the tree line at the edge of the village, thick with pine and birch. So close, so full of fuel, so utterly off limits. It's time we talk about why no one's burning firewood, at least no one like you. First, the obvious, trees are finite. In medieval Europe, especially by the 14th century, deforestation was already a serious issue near populated areas. Forests weren't just random patches of trees. They were managed, guarded, and most importantly, owned. Kings, nobles, abbots. All of them claimed forests as part of their wealth. Cutting down trees without permission wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal, sometimes fatally so. You wander toward the manor edge of the village, where the local lord's estate begins. There's a wooden fence, not particularly tall, but symbolically massive. Beyond it lies the forest. You can hear it. The rustle of wind in leaves, the creak of branches, the whisper of warmth you're not allowed to have. The gamekeepers here are not shy. They carry short bows and clubs. You've heard stories, peasants caught gathering twigs punished with mutilation, or worse, hung for stealing the king's trees. It sounds absurd. It is absurd, but that's feudalism for you. Trees are power, and you don't have any. A boy named Godric walks beside you, pointing to a distant pile of brush. "See that?" he says, barely above a whisper. "That's all we're allowed. Fallen sticks. If the Lord's men don't catch you first." The pile looks pitiful. A squirrel would be disappointed. You try gathering some kindling yourself. Twigs, dry leaves, a broken branch half buried in snow. You fill your arms, proud of your little haul. Then Godric laughs and says it'll burn for maybe 10 minutes. If that. Great. Just enough time to warm your fingers and remember what comfort could feel like. Back in the village, you hear arguments. 2 women are yelling about a missing dung pile. Apparently someone stole it during the night. Again, it's not the first time. People are getting desperate. Without a steady fuel source, you can't cook, you can't keep warm, you can't keep your kids from freezing in their sleep. So yeah, people steal cow poop now. That's the reality. The historical part here gets even grimmer. During the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that started in the 14th century, Europe experienced colder winters, shorter growing seasons, and increased rainfall. Crops failed. People starved. And firewood? It went from being a daily necessity to a tightly controlled resource. In many places, laws were passed to restrict wood gathering even further. Forest rights became a class divide. Lords could hunt and cut wood freely. Peasants? They were out of luck. Some records show that entire villages were fined for collective wood theft. That's right. Even if one person was caught dragging a log home, the whole village paid. It wasn't about the wood, it was about control. And that brings us to a strange little fringe fact. In some towns, peasants burned roof thatch when things got really bad. That's right, they ripped the straw off their own homes to feed the fire. It was like eating your walls to stay alive. Of course, then the rain and snow came in, and everything got worse. But hey, at least you weren't cold, for a little while. You walk past a cottage with a suspiciously patchy roof. The family inside waves at you. They look warm, miserable, but warm. You try not to judge. Who wouldn't do the same? Around noon, you join a work party heading into the woods. Not for wood, but for dead bramble and thornbush. It's a legal grey area. No one owns the brambles and they're barely flammable, but they'll spark if dry enough. You carry bundles back to the village, hands bleeding from thorns. It's exhausting, humiliating, and somehow still better than freezing to death. By now you've started to appreciate just how intense winter survival is without modern tech. No central heating, no backup generator, just human willpower and whatever the earth, or the animals, can provide. You think back to your own time and the luxury of pressing a button for warmth. Here, a fire means everything. The smell of smoke on your clothes becomes comforting. It means you're still alive. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about just how bad firewood scarcity was across medieval Europe. Some argue it was localised, worse in heavily populated or deforested regions. Others suggest the problem was more widespread, especially during climate shifts. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that for the peasant class, fuel was a daily struggle, a matter of survival, and a symbol of inequality. As evening falls, the cold sharpens again. You sit with Godric's family, eating thin leek broth cooked over a smouldering dung fire. It tastes edible. The room smells like burned hair and smoke. No one complains, they're just glad it's warm. You glance toward the window, a square hole covered with animal gut stretched tight. The wind outside howls. Somewhere in the village someone coughs. A bad sign. Illness spreads fast in the cold. But no one has time to worry. Tomorrow the search for fuel begins again. The fire flickers lower, you inch closer, and hope it lasts the night. The first thing you smell in the morning isn't breakfast. It's smoke. Dull, earthy, and strangely sour. The fire never really went out last night, but it's more embers now, coughing up the last of its fuel. A shriveled black patty of dung smoulders half-heartedly in the hearth, and the little heat it offers is already drifting toward the roof. Godric's mother is hunched over the ashes, poking at them with a bent iron rod, trying to coax just enough flame to boil water. Not for tea. For oats, maybe. Or for soaking a dirty cloth. You don't ask. You just breathe through your mouth and pretend this is all perfectly normal. By now, you know the routine. Collect, dry, stack, burn, repeat. But dung isn't the only thing on the medieval peasant's weird little winter menu of fuels. Today, you're going to meet the other contender. Bones. That's right. Not metaphorical ones. Real bones. Animal bones. Occasionally even human ones if you want to get dark about it. It starts when Godric invites you to the outskirts of the village near the butchering sheds. There's no actual butcher here, just families that know how to skin a pig without slicing their thumbs off. You follow him past a frozen trough and piles of hay covered in frost, toward a low pit filled with broken, scorched animal parts. At first you think it's just trash, but then he picks up a long, charred femur and holds it out to you like a prized relic. "We burn these," he says. "They crackle loud and stink like sin, but they keep the kettle hot." You take it. It's surprisingly heavy, and the ends are blackened from previous burns. Bone, especially from cows or pigs, doesn't exactly make for a roaring fire, but when dried and placed over coals it holds heat. The marrow, once burned out, leaves behind a brittle husk that glows for longer than you'd expect. It won't keep you alive through a blizzard, but it might boil a pot or warm your hands, if you don't mind the smell. Back in the village square you watch as an older woman named Hilda stokes her hearth with a mix of kindling, peat, and what's very clearly a handful of old soup bones. She mutters something about not wasting what's already dead, and you can't argue with that. When there's no firewood, no dung, and the wind howls like a hungry god, bone becomes just another piece of the puzzle. The historical fact here is surprisingly well documented in niche accounts. Bones, especially from slaughtered livestock, were sometimes used as supplementary fuel in extremely resource-strapped communities. While not an ideal or consistent source, they were burned out of necessity, particularly in colder regions with little access to wood or peat. Some monasteries even had designated bone pits that doubled as waste dumps and emergency kindling caches, recycling, before it was cool. Of course, not everyone agrees on how common this was. Some scholars argue it's mostly folklore, rural exaggeration passed down through the centuries. Others point to archaeological finds, scorched bone fragments in medieval hearths and cooking pits. The problem is, bones get burned during cooking too, so it's hard to know whether people were intentionally using them as fuel or just tossing leftovers into the fire. Still, when you're standing next to a heap of half-burned oxtibius in Rothford, the debate feels kind of academic. Then there's the fringe stuff. In parts of Eastern Europe, tales linger about bone fires, used not just for warmth, but for rituals, warding off spirits, honouring the dead, or, more grimly, disposing of remains during plagues. Some historians roll their eyes at this, calling it superstition tangled with desperation. Others suggest that when you're knee-deep in a winter, where nothing grows and everything dies, you're allowed a little superstition. You walk with Godric past the village well, frozen solid at the edges, toward an abandoned shed that smells faintly of tallow and decay. Inside, bones hang from hooks, mostly cleaned, some cracked open for marrow. A few have been whittled into tools or charms. One hangs by a string shaped like a crude little person. You don't ask what it's for. You're learning that not every tradition comes with an explanation. Later in the day, you help Elsbeth prepare a fire for evening. She has a small stash hidden beneath the floorboards, a mix of dried dung, a few twisted branches that somehow escaped the Lord's eyes, and a handful of what you now recognise as sheep bones. She stacks them like puzzle pieces, whispering a prayer under her breath. You don't know the words, but you recognise the tone. Half hope, half habit. As the fire catches, the bones begin to crackle. It's a sharp, dry sound, like snapping twigs underwater. The smell isn't great, something between singed hair and burnt broth, but the heat is real. It fills the tiny room, curling around your feet and working its way up your legs. You feel, for the first time all day, almost warm. That night, Godric tells you a story about a man who once burned his wife's bones after she died of fever. Not for warmth, but because the ground was too frozen to dig. The fire kept him alive, Godric says, but the village never forgave him. You ask what happened to the man. Godric shrugs. He moved to the forest, or the wolves got him. Depends on who you ask. There's a chill in the room that has nothing to do with temperature. You stare at the hearth, watching a bone glow red and then collapse into ash. There's something deeply unsettling about it, but also something practical. These people aren't monsters. They're not savages. They're just cold and hungry and tired, and every scrap, every morsel, every brittle bone is a weapon in their war against winter. You lie down close to the fire again, the straw poking through the wool of your blanket, the smoke still clinging to your clothes. Outside, the wind howls high and sharp. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barks once, then stops. In the distance, you hear a tree snap under the weight of frost. That tree will never see a hearth. Not here, not now. And you, still warm for the moment, wonder what you'll be burning tomorrow. You wake up coughing. Not the soft, polite kind of cough you can hide behind a sleeve, but the kind that grabs your lungs and shakes them like they owe it money. The room is thick with smoke. Not rolling clouds, but the low invisible kind that creeps just above the floor, seeps into your hair, and clings to your tongue with a sour, sooty aftertaste. Godric is already up, half wrapped in a coarse wool shawl, dragging yesterday's ashes out with a flat-bladed spade. The bones are gone now, crumbled, scattered, absorbed into the black dust that coats everything. This is just how it is. You've accepted it, sort of. But today you're going to learn something that shifts your understanding again. something you might not expect in this world of dirt floors and frostbitten toes. Medieval peasants didn't just use dung and bones, they traded them. Welcome to the poop economy. It starts innocently enough. You're following Elsbeth to the edge of the village, her arms full of carefully stacked dung patties, bound together with a thin rope like an incredibly cursed bouquet. You assume she's going to the drying racks, or maybe offering them to a neighbour. Nope. She's bartering. For onions. She meets with another woman, Marga, whose family somehow has access to a root cellar with a half-dozen onions still hanging from the rafters. Not fancy onions either, shriveled, sprouting slightly, but onions nonetheless. Marga eyes the dung pile like a merchant sizing up gold. They argue briefly. 5 patties for 3 onions, or 6 patties for 2 onions and a half cup of barley meal. It's intense. Voices are low but firm. Eventually they settle on the trade, and the swap is made with all the solemnity of an arms deal. You blink. Dung is currency, not just a fuel, not just a gross necessity. It's actual capital. Later you find out that in some parts of rural Europe, especially during prolonged cold spells or famines, families literally kept dung accounts. They knew who owed what, who contributed to communal piles, and who skimmed off the top. Dry patties were stored like firewood, stacked in sheds or under lean-tos, often with small wooden tokens used to track quantities. Some villages had agreed upon values. 1 dry cow patty equals 2 eggs. A bundle equals a day's fire. A whole winter's worth. You're rich. There's even gossip. Someone down the lane supposedly mixes his dung with too much straw, making it burn faster and smell worse. He's been called out more than once, but always claims the animals are sickly, and the consistency can't be helped. You don't have the guts to investigate, but the quiet dung politics of the village are very, very real. It's not just about trade, it's also about pride. You visit a family that raises geese, and the father proudly shows you his personal fuel cache. A blend of goose droppings, straw, and a little clay for binding. It's formed into small bricks and stacked under a lean roof. He calls them feathered fire cakes. You don't laugh. He's dead serious. And when he throws one on the hearth later that night, it burns surprisingly well, emitting a strange, almost sweet smell that makes your eyes water. Here's a fun historical fact to chew on while you gag. In some rural areas of Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in highland regions, animal dung, especially from horses and cattle, was not only used as fuel, but processed with ash and clay to create more durable, slow-burning briquettes. This wasn't primitive ignorance, it was chemistry born of necessity. People figured out how to make poop more efficient, but again, historians debate how systematic this was. Some argue that these dung economies were isolated to areas with extreme fuel shortages or deforestation. Others believe it was far more widespread and just underreported, because understandably, no one wanted to write, "We heated our homes with feces" in the family Bible. Fringe fact. Some historians point to a particular peasant rebellion in the 15th century that may have been partially fueled, pun very much intended, by rising tensions over access to dung. Not land, not taxes, dung. Apparently, one noble family tried to tax the collection of manure in their lands. The peasants revolted, and while the uprising was squashed in the usual bloody fashion, it left behind a few court records that mention waste disputes as part of the complaint. It's all pretty murky, but hey, it wouldn't be the weirdest reason someone grabbed a pitchfork in medieval Europe. Meanwhile, back in Hrothford, Elsbeth explains her own dung schedule. Cow dung is the gold standard, of course, hotter burn, less stink. Pig dung is less desirable, burns fast, smells worse. Chicken dung is usable only in a pinch and generally mixed with straw to slow it down. Human waste is the absolute last resort, and even then, only with heavy dilution, lots of drying, and ideally a prayer. You ask about peat, just to make conversation, and she makes a face like you asked if she burns puppies. "Peat's for the bog people," she says. "We don't have land like that, and digging peat makes the ghosts angry." You're not sure if that last part is a joke. Later, while helping clean out a barn, you find a half-broken board with tally marks etched into it. Each cluster is marked with a symbol, one for dung, one for dried reeds, one for twigs. A crude, resource-tracking system carved into wood that's too brittle to be burned. It's like stumbling across an ancient, Spreadsheet. You show it to Elsbeth, who nods. That was from the bad winter when Godric was born. Her voice goes quiet. We nearly didn't make it. That night, Godric shows you his secret stash behind the smokehouse. Just 5 patties, perfectly round and dried, stacked neatly beneath a bit of burlap. In case we lose ours, he whispers, or if someone steals from us. You want to laugh, but you can't, because that might be the difference between warmth and frostbite next week. And so you sit beside the hearth again, the fire fed by something that once steamed in a pasture. The smell by now has become strangely comforting, like leather, smoke, and survival. You think about your own world, where we flush this stuff away like garbage. Here it's life. Here it's a currency. Here it's the only reason you're still breathing. And tomorrow, you'll be back out there, trading waste for warmth, 1 patty at a time. You smell it before you see it. A deep, smoky stench with hints of burnt fur, wet hay, and something vaguely sour. You've gotten used to the background odour of Hrothford, a consistent perfume of livestock, mildew, and desperate humanity. But this is something else entirely. It hits you when you open the door and step outside into the pale morning light, cold enough to freeze your eyelashes. It's coming from 2 doors down, where a family is burning their entire supply of dried dung at once. You can see the smoke billowing out of the chimney, thick and curling like it's trying to escape the smell of itself. You head that way out of curiosity, but also because curiosity is the only thing that moves fast in this kind of cold. The house belongs to a man named Toth, who you've seen only a handful of times. He doesn't talk much. His hands are always black with soot, and his boots are patched with rope. Today, he's standing outside with a blank expression while the inside of his house becomes an inferno of bad choices. You ask what's going on, and he just mutters, "Had to do it. Couldn't stand the cold." And that's the thing no one really talks about in medieval winter survival. Sometimes the cold wins, not by killing you outright, but by wearing you down until you make stupid decisions, like burning everything you have in a single day for a brief glimpse of comfort. You step inside the house and instantly regret it. The heat is almost unbearable, a sudden slap of humid, acrid warmth that stings your eyes. The air is thick with smoke, not just from dung, but from whatever else Toth tossed in. Probably animal bedding, straw, a broken stool, maybe even bits of his roof. You sit for a minute. It's the warmest you've been since arriving here, and yet it feels wrong. Like someone lit a funeral pyre inside their own home, because that's exactly what this is. Toth just burned through his entire week's worth of fuel. Tomorrow, his house will be colder than anyone's. Tomorrow, he may not wake up at all. Back at Elsbeth's, there's a quiet panic brewing, not loud or dramatic, just a slow churn of concern because everyone saw the smoke and knows what it means. Toth broke. The unspoken rule here is moderation. Pace yourself. Hoard the heat. Lose that and you lose everything. You sit by the fire, if you can call it that. Tonight it's more of a warm suggestion than actual flames. A single smouldering patty, a few dry reeds, and what looks suspiciously like a piece of a wooden spoon that accidentally broke earlier. Elsbeth doesn't mention it. No one does. You don't waste words on something that hurts this much. Here's a historical nugget for you. People in the Middle Ages often kept cooking and heating fires going continuously, sometimes for months. Letting a fire go out meant you had to relight it, and matches didn't exist yet. So families would shield a tiny ember under ashes overnight, hoping to coax it back to life each morning. If the ember died, you had to beg a hot coal from a neighbour, or, if you were really desperate, try to spark one with flint and steel, assuming you had either. Fire wasn't just fuel, it was continuity, it was stability, it was something you protected like a child. That's why people burned, well, just about everything. You learn this firsthand when Elsbeth calmly walks over to a low chest in the corner of the cottage, opens it, and pulls out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, scraps of wool, a bit of old parchment, and a brittle wooden comb. She tosses them into the fire one by one. They flare, hiss, and vanish. The room warms slightly. The smell is complicated. This, it turns out, is the real heart of peasant winter. The slow, painful burning of your life, piece by piece. You ask what happens when there's nothing left. Elsbeth shrugs. We burn the stool. Then what? We tear the thatch. And after that, Then we pray. The scholarly debate here is interesting. Some researchers believe the idea of peasants regularly burning household items is exaggerated, based on later accounts, not contemporary ones. Others argue that archaeological evidence shows consistent burn patterns on domestic objects, broken handles, bits of furniture, even clothing. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. People didn't toss their best chairs into the fire at the first sign of frost. But when it came down to it, survival trumped sentiment every time. Fringe fact of the night. In some particularly brutal winters, villagers were known to burn the dried carcasses of plague victims, not ceremonially, just because they needed the fuel. It's not something you'll find in many textbooks, but a few scattered records mention bone and cloth heaps, used to start fires during prolonged sieges and famines. Grim? Absolutely. But that's what coal does to people. Back in Rothford, you help Elsbeth tear apart a broken basket for kindling. The woven slats snap easily. The basket belonged to her mother. You hesitate. She doesn't. Into the fire it goes. Godric watches silently. He's learning something too. How to make hard choices. You wonder how many winters he'll survive. You wonder how many you would. That night, the fire is small but steady. You're down to the last of the dried patties for the week. No one says it out loud, but you're all doing math in your heads. Tomorrow is market day. If the snow clears, there might be someone willing to trade fuel. Or not. There are rumours that travellers froze to death on the road last week. No one went out to check. Why would they? You sleep closer to the hearth than ever. Your nose stings from the smoke. Your feet are numb. But for now, you're warm. You dream of a bonfire made of clean, dry wood. And you wake up to the smell of burning hair and the reality that dreams don't keep you alive. The cold is getting inside you now. Not just your skin, but deeper. Into the parts that don't usually feel things. You wake up stiff, not from sleep, but from having spent the entire night trying not to move, tucked so tightly into your blanket you might as well have been mummified. There's no fire this morning. Not even embers. The hearth is just a pile of grey powder with black flecks, and the air feels like it's been filtered through stone. You try to wriggle your toes, and they obey, but sluggishly. That counts as a victory. Elsbeth is already awake, standing at the door with her arms crossed, staring out at the snow. Her breath forms tight little clouds that drift out the open doorway and vanish instantly. She's waiting. Not for anything in particular, just waiting. Maybe hoping. Maybe calculating how many hours until dusk returns. Godric bursts in, nearly slipping on the frozen threshold, holding something long and stiff wrapped in a cloth. "Found it," he says, grinning, and unrolls it on the table. It's a bone, a big one. You think maybe a horse femur or a cow's leg, but when Elsbeth sees it, she frowns. "We burned the last of the bones," Godric nods. "This was in the midden. You don't want to know what else was in that midden, but it's impressive. The bone is dry enough to burn. He must have dug through a frozen wall of refuse to get it. That's dedication, or desperation, or both. Today, you're learning about the strange and increasingly disturbing alternatives to wood, dung, and bones. Because when everything familiar is gone, when the dung is burned, the kindling wet, and the hearth empty, people get inventive. Enter the world of burning bones again. But now we mean them differently, because now we're talking about boiling them down. Elsbeth pulls out a large blackened pot, hangs it over a few twigs and bits of bark Godric found under a tree, and places the bone inside with a splash of grey water. She's not cooking food, she's cooking glue, or what passes for it. As the bone simmers, she explains, after long boiling, some bones release a greasy residue that can be skimmed and used like tallow, not just for candles or ceiling boots, but as a sticky, slow-burning fire starter. It's not much, it smells awful. But in this frozen world, it's better than nothing. Godric fetches a small cloth, dips it in the fatty film rising in the pot, and rolls it into a tight wick. Later, when dried, it'll catch flame faster than straw. Add a sprinkle of ash or crushed charcoal, and you've got the medieval version of a firelighter. You nod, impressed. Kind of. It still smells like a butcher shop after an electrical fire, but it works. This is where history gets weird. in regions where even dung was scarce, like mountainous zones during the harsher years of the 14th century. People found increasingly bizarre things to burn. Animal hides, hair, old leather shoes. Anything with even a whisper of oil or fat content was fair game. Tanners and butchers suddenly became valuable, not for what they made, but for the offcuts they threw away. You're invited to a nearby home where an old man named Wulfric is brewing up something even stranger. He's boiling hooves, goat hooves to be precise. You almost gag at the smell before you even cross the threshold. It's a chemical assault on every part of your soul, like burnt rubber dipped in spoiled soup. Gelatin, Wulfric grunts, stirring the cauldron. It hardens quick, catches fire better when frozen. He pours the resulting slurry into a cracked clay bowl and lets it cool near the hearth. Later he'll slice it into chunks and add it to dung patties. Apparently it boosts the burn time. You nod like this makes sense, because now it does. Historians still argue about how much of this was common practice, and how much was regional ingenuity. Bone boiling, glue making, and gelatin fire starters aren't exactly headline-grabbing innovations, but scattered evidence from monastic records and estate logs shows references to boiled hooves, candle leavings, and tanner's waste being redistributed in winters, especially during resource shortages. Some monasteries even collected these materials from peasants as partial tax payments, if that gives you any idea how valuable a bucket of hoof slime could be. One offbeat bit of speculation. A few modern researchers believe the act of burning bones, particularly skulls or limb fragments, might have had ritual elements in some regions. Not quite witchcraft, but closer to ancestor reverence. The idea being that burning the remains of your livestock, or in darker tales your enemies, added a kind of protective charm to the fire. Most scholars dismiss this as folklore twisted by centuries of retelling. Still, when you're watching Wulfric toss a half-melted goat hoof into a bubbling cauldron and mutter under his breath, you start to wonder. Back at Elsbeth's, the gelatin-stiffened wick has dried enough to test. Godric lights it with a glowing coal stolen from Wulfric's hearth, and it sparks to life impressively fast, flaring with a pale yellow flame that smells like singed soup bones. The room warms slightly, everyone exhales in relief, and you realise how low the bar has gotten. A single flame is a cause for celebration now. You help Elsbeth mix the remaining fat skim with crushed bark and rags. These will serve as tonight's fuel, small bricks of gelatinized desperation. The fire burns longer tonight, steadier and less smoky. Somehow it smells marginally better than dung. You curl up close to it, staring into the flicker of innovation born of starvation. Somewhere in your mind you're cataloguing what's left. Straw, leather scraps, some old wool, maybe a belt or two. You know where this road leads, and you're starting to understand just how resourceful people had to be to avoid walking it. That night, Godric asks you what people burn in your time. You think about it. Electricity, gas, logs from the hardware store that come pre-cut and pesticide-free. You think about flicking a switch. You think about not dying just because the temperature dropped. You don't answer. Instead, you lie still, listening to the fire crackle faint and slow as bones burn their second life. There's a sound you learn to dread in Rothford, the clean, confident crack of an axe striking wood. Not because it means danger, but because it means inequality, and it cuts sharper than the cold. This morning you hear it from the far side of the village, echoing off the frost-bitten stone walls like a mocking drumbeat. Someone has firewood, real firewood, which means someone has power, and spoiler alert, it's not you. You follow the sound up the hill past rows of sagging huts and snow-blasted thatch, until you reach the manor grounds. A modest wooden palisade surrounds the estate, more symbolic than practical, like a fancy do not touch sign. Through the slats you glimpse him, Lord Hulric in his heavy wool cloak sipping from a metal goblet, while two servants swing axes at a large pile of split birch logs. The wood is dry, clean, fragrant even. The kind of firewood that makes you nostalgic for a world you've never lived in. Hulric doesn't even look cold. He's got a fire pit roaring behind him, its smoke drifting straight up into the blue morning sky like a smug middle finger. One of the servants carries a bundle of logs into the main hall, where tapestries hang and windows, actual glass windows, reflect the weak sunlight. You'd ask how it feels to have an entire forest at your disposal, But you already know. It feels warm. It's not just a modern sense of fairness that makes this sting. Even in their own time, peasants like Elsbeth and Godric knew the difference, knew how wide the gap was, and they knew it was enforced not just by wealth, but by law. Elsbeth tells you about Assart laws over a bowl of thin oat gruel, still warm from the gelatin fire starter. In short, they forbid peasants from clearing forested land for farming or fuel without permission from the lord, and getting permission meant paying a fee, one most couldn't afford. Even gathering deadwood from the forest floor was restricted. That part makes your jaw drop. Deadwood. The kindling equivalent of pocket lint. Off limits unless you wanted to risk punishment. This was all part of the forest law system, especially in places like England and France, where royal forests weren't just about trees. They were status symbols, hunting grounds, and sources of timber for shipbuilding and fortresses. Peasants were trespassers in their own backyards. The trees they passed every day belonged to someone else. Godric tells you a story, probably passed down from his older brother or some village drunk, about a man who stole a branch no bigger than a broomstick. The lord's men caught him and made an example of him, cut off 3 fingers so he could never gather wood again. You hope it's just a story, but it doesn't feel like one. What's not debated is this. Fuel inequality in the Middle Ages wasn't just economic, it was existential. Nobles had access to forests, charcoal, servants to cut and stack the wood, and thick stone walls to trap the heat. Peasants had fingers crossed. That was about it. But here's a detail that's both fascinating and infuriating. Nobles sometimes burned wood inefficiently on purpose. Open fires for aesthetic effect, roasting meats on spits that rotated over logs fed constantly, even though a closed hearth or bread oven would have used less fuel. It was a performance. The waste was part of the point, like burning money to prove you had too much of it. Some lords even hosted winter feasts outdoors, under awnings, with roaring fires to show off just how not worried they were about fuel. Meanwhile, down in the village, someone was boiling bones and burning stool. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. Of course, the scholarly debate kicks in here. Some argue that nobles weren't always so thoughtless, and in harsher climates they did implement regulated systems, fuel quotas, woodland preservation plans, even allowing peasants fire rights during certain months. Others say those were rare exceptions, and the rule was generally this. If you can't pay, you can't burn. And if you burn without paying, you'd better not get caught. Back in Rothford, the chill creeps lower into the valley as the sun begins to dip behind the hills. The rich heat of birch smoke lingers in the air, drifting down from the manor like the smell of cake at a famine. Elsbeth wrinkles her nose. "You smell that?" she asks. "That's our forest burning." She's not being poetic. The manor owns the trees. The trees grow on the land. The land is technically part of the lord's holdings. Ergo, the firewood that could save a dozen families is now crackling merrily beneath a venison spit. You walk back down the hill with the family, the snow crunching beneath. Your boots, brittle and sharp. It's too cold for new footprints to hold. Everything is ice. Even your breath feels like it's freezing before it leaves your mouth. When you reach Elsbeth's house again, the fire has gone out. Godric relights it with one of the hoarded patties, flicking a coal into a bundle of straw and wool. The flame is weak, but it catches. You all lean in toward the warmth, like moths that have made peace with the smoke. Later that evening, you hear laughter from the manor. Music. The unmistakable sound of people eating too much and not caring. It echoes through the village like a cruel lullaby. Godric doesn't say anything. He just adds another bone to the fire. It's not much, but it's his. The snow has a crust today, thin, brittle and sharp, like glass ground to powder. Each step crunches loudly, echoing in the stillness like a guilty confession. You're heading toward the woods again, but not for the view. You've been invited, well, pressured, into a little morning activity that most of the village pretends doesn't happen. Illegal firewood gathering, that's right. Today, you're going to steal sticks. It's Godric who nudged you awake before dawn, hissing that it's now or never. His breath fogged in the air and his excitement was impossible to argue with. You'd barely had a sip of whatever lukewarm root tea Elsbeth called breakfast before you were trudging across frozen fields toward the tree line. The woods look innocent enough, their bare branches swaying in the windless cold, but you know better now. This forest belongs to the Lord, and by stepping across the boundary line, you've just committed a crime. You, a fully modern person with a healthy respect for property rights and a fear of getting arrested for literally anything, are now a felon. Congratulations. Godric explains the rules in a whisper. Never cut. Only gather what's already fallen, no axes, no dragging logs, too noisy. And if you see the reeve or one of the gamekeepers, run. Not walk, run. The two of you move like ghosts beneath the trees, your eyes scanning the forest floor for anything remotely useful. Twigs, branches, bark. Godric points out a bundle of broken pine boughs half buried in snow, and you gather them like stolen treasure. Every stick feels like a risk, like a breath you're not sure you're allowed to take. Somewhere in the distance a crow caws, and your stomach drops. You know it's just a bird, but your body is convinced it's a signal. Every sound feels like a summons. Every gust of wind could be boots approaching. You manage to collect a decent armful before Godric freezes mid-step. You see it too, a figure moving through the woods, maybe 50 yards away. Too far to identify, too close to ignore. Without a word, Godric grabs your arm and bolts. You run like you're being chased by winter itself, sticks flying from your arms as you leap fallen logs and duck under low branches. When you finally collapse behind a ridge, panting and covered in frost and mud, Godric just grins. "Close one," he says. Like this is all a game. You want to be mad, you want to remind him that getting caught could mean lashes or worse. But you're also holding 3 solid sticks of dry pine, and in Hrothford that's basically gold. The two of you trudge home, avoiding the main paths, ducking behind cottages, trying not to look too satisfied. Elspeth doesn't say anything when you return, but her eyes narrow slightly at the pine branches. She knows. Everyone knows. No one says a word. Now you understand why firewood is such a loaded issue. Pun completely intended. Here's the historical angle. Forest laws in medieval Europe were strict, often absurdly so. Common folk were routinely forbidden from entering wooded areas without permission, especially royal forests or hunting grounds. The punishments varied: fines, confiscation, imprisonment. But in times of crisis, they could be brutal. Records show men losing hands, being branded, or even hanged for repeated offences. The laws were meant to protect resources for the elite, particularly game animals and timber. But they also functioned as a reminder: these trees are not yours. Some villages negotiated limited rights, like the Estovers in England, where peasants were allowed to gather firewood under strict conditions. But these exceptions were fragile, often revoked without warning. You find out from Elsbeth that Hrothford used to have a firewood allowance during feast days, but then Lord Halric's father revoked it after someone allegedly poached a deer. That was 20 years ago. No one's dared ask again. Fringe fact time. In certain regions, peasants use secret paths called smugglers' trails to transport illegal firewood into their homes under cover of darkness. Some were so well used that over centuries they became permanent roads. A few modern hiking trails in Europe unknowingly follow these ancient forbidden footpaths. So next time you're out enjoying a scenic forest walk, you might just be retracing the steps of a terrified peasant with a sack full of stolen branches. Back in the cottage, the fire roars brighter than it has in days. Pine burns fast and hot, and the sweet resinous scent fills the air like something out of a dream. For a brief hour it's almost cosy. Almost. Elsbeth uses the heat to boil water for washing, an extravagance you hadn't even considered possible until now. Godric laughs as he pours warm water over his hands, his red, cracked knuckles finally relaxing for the first time in weeks. You sit close to the fire, soaking in the stolen warmth, knowing it won't last. The pine is already sputtering down to embers, but in that moment you understand the temptation, the constant pull between survival and the law, between what you need and what you're allowed to have. Later that evening, you hear shouting in the village square. Someone else got caught. Not from your group, thankfully, but a boy from the next village over. He was seen dragging a branch too thick to be considered fallen. He's now locked in a grain shed until the reeve decides what to do. People mutter, some are angry, some are scared, but most are just tired. Another lesson in what happens when you break the unspoken rules. You fall asleep that night still smelling of pine smoke, your hands sore from gripping branches too tightly. The fire is low but steady, and the guilt feels like a second layer of clothing. Itchy, heavy, necessary. You dream of trees, not the real ones, not the kind that get you punished, but the kind that grow for you, just for you, and never say no. The next morning greets you not with the usual thin grey light, but with a strange kind of muffled stillness. It's the kind of quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. You sit up, blink away the sleep, and immediately notice the light has changed. Brighter, crisper, yet somehow still bleak. Godric's already up, boots on, peering out the door with a look of nervous excitement. "It snowed again," he mutters, "but not much, just a skin." You step outside with him, squinting against the glare. The snow has indeed settled into a smooth, shallow sheet. Only an inch or two, but enough to make everything look fresh. Or fresher, anyway. You know better than to fall for the illusion. Nothing is new in Rothford, just briefly disguised. And under that pretty dusting of white, the same frozen mud, the same decaying thatch, the same desperation. Today you're not heading to the woods. No, today's adventure is muddier, colder and wetter. You've been invited, this time by Elsbeth herself, to visit the bog. "Peat," she says simply when you ask why. "We dig it, dry it, and burn it." She says it like she's describing peeling a turnip. Nothing grand, just what people do, but from the way she wraps an extra scarf around her face and ties it tightly, you can tell this isn't going to be a pleasant stroll. You, Elsbeth, Godric, and another man named Tom trudge for nearly an hour through the snow-covered fields, until the land starts to sag and darken. The air grows heavier, wetter, and with it comes a smell you can't quite place. Part plant rot, part wet dog, part something older and sourer. Then you see it, the bog. It's not quite a swamp, but close enough. A wide, low patch of land, brown and black, with little tufts of grass and pools of icy water. It looks like the earth itself is rotting, which technically it is. That's the whole point of peat. Godric pulls out a long-handled spade and begins to dig, his breath forming thick clouds as he leans into the frozen muck. You help, or at least you try. The ground resists you. It's not like shoveling dirt. It's more like trying to scoop pudding out of a freezer with a fork. Every cut of the spade produces a dark, wet slab, almost like sponge cake soaked in grave water. These are peat bricks, and they're heavier than you'd expect for something that burns. Elsbeth explains while she works. Peat comes from old plants, pressed down for hundreds of years. All that rot becomes fuel. You nod, mostly because it's the only part of your body that doesn't hurt yet. The first few bricks you lift squelch and drip brown water, but as you get deeper, the peat becomes more solid, black, dense. Already your gloves are soaked, and your boots are starting to leak. But there's no turning back. Here's the historical note you didn't know you needed. In regions where forests were scarce, think Ireland, parts of Scotland, the Low Countries, peat wasn't just a backup plan. It was the fuel. Entire industries formed around cutting, drying and trading peat. There were peat rights, peat taxes, even peat smuggling. The stuff was everywhere, both above ground and in legal disputes. Back in Rothford, peat is a luxury only available to those willing to make the trip. The bog lies just outside the Lord's official lands, which means it's technically free for the taking. But it's also dangerous. More than one villager has gotten stuck out here. Broken ankles, frostbite, even full-on sinkings. You don't ask about that last one. You're too focused on not becoming part of the peat yourself. After several hours, the group has collected a pile of dripping black bricks. They're stacked carefully onto a sled, an old door with ropes, and dragged back to the village. But they're not ready to burn yet. First, they must be dried. Back in the village, you help lay them out on wooden racks near the animal pens where the wind will wick away the moisture over the next several days. Peat needs time to become useful. If you burn it too wet, it hisses and smokes like an angry cat and barely produces heat. Dry, though, it burns low and long, perfect for baking bread or keeping embers alive overnight. Elsbeth sets aside a few smaller half-dry bricks and places them near the hearth to finish curing. "These'll go in tomorrow's stew fire," she says, already planning 3 days ahead. Godric, still soaked to the knees, looks less thrilled. "I think I got peat in my socks." You laugh, until you realise you did too. Now, here's where things get a little heated, pun aggressively intended. Among historians, there's been plenty of debate over just how widespread peat use really was in mainland Europe during the Middle Ages. Some argue it was mostly regional, confined to areas naturally boggy and without forest access. Others suggest that as deforestation increased, peat became a vital alternative fuel in many places, even in drier regions where it had to be transported in bundles. Archaeological digs in northern Europe have uncovered storage pits and drying racks specifically built for peat, but whether this was common or just clever adaptation, still an open question. Then there's the fringe fact, which is slightly less charming. In some areas, old peat bogs became burial sites, not intentionally, just practically. The ground was soft, the water kept the smell down, and during outbreaks of disease or famine, bogs absorbed the dead as readily as they absorbed rain. Some of those same burial bogs were later mined for fuel, accidentally digging up preserved remains. Yeah, peat fires occasionally came with some extra ingredients. You don't mention this to Elsbeth. That night the fire is weak but steady. One of the half-dry peat bricks is burning now. It sizzles a little, but the room is warmer than it has been in days. The smell is earthy. Not quite pleasant, but less offensive than dung. You sit beside the hearth, feeling the gentle heat seep into your bones like a whispered apology. Godric's asleep on a straw mat. Elsbeth's humming softly while mending a torn tunic. Outside, the wind howls again, carrying the same song it's been singing all winter, thin, high, and merciless. But here, in this small room, the fire holds, and tomorrow the peat will burn brighter. By now, you've learned that staying warm in Rothford is like juggling knives. Dangerous, exhausting, and eventually you're going to get cut. Even the peat, dependable as it seemed yesterday, isn't the perfect solution. The bricks crack when dried too fast, crumble when they're too wet, and the smoke? Let's just say if the wind's not right, your neighbours will know exactly what you're burning and start asking questions. Which brings us to today's lesson. When the earth and animals fail, and the forests are off limits, people turn to the one thing they've always had a complicated relationship with: each other. It starts just before dawn. You're half asleep, curled up near the hearth, when shouting cuts through the frozen hush. Not the usual village argument about missing hens or whose ox is stealing whose hay. This is sharper, meaner, accusations. You stumble outside to find a group of villagers, 3 women and a boy, surrounding a wiry older man near the well. They're yelling about peat theft. Apparently someone's drying bricks went missing during the night, and this man, Brand, a day labourer who lives on the edge of town, has a fire going way too early and way too hot. Suspiciously hot. Brand claims he found old wood in the ditch. Everyone else knows that's a lie. There hasn't been unclaimed wood in these parts since your great-grandfather's great-grandfather was born, and even if there were, no one burns it at sunrise unless they're hiding something. Elsbeth arrives late, eyes narrowed, lips tight. She doesn't say a word, but her presence shifts the energy. People back off slightly. Brand throws a few more denials into the air, then stomps back to his hut, muttering about how everyone's frozen and stupid, which is a fair assessment, honestly, but also, almost definitely, he's guilty. You learn that this kind of thing happens more often than anyone likes to admit. Drying racks get raided, dung piles blow away mysteriously, fire starters go missing. In a world where fuel is survival, theft becomes a nightly ritual, carried out quietly, desperately, and often by people who swore they'd never stoop so low. Now, here's your historical note. Rural communities in the Middle Ages weren't all hand-holding, soup-sharing utopias. Sure, there was solidarity, but that cracked fast when resources got tight. During especially harsh winters or poor harvests, documented cases of petty theft skyrocketed. Not just food, but fuel, clothes, even thatch ripped from roofs to keep someone else's fire going. And when justice came, it was usually local, messy, and fueled by rumour. In fact, some manorial records show that villagers were more likely to be punished for stealing fuel than for stealing food. Why? Because food could spoil. Fuel had value for weeks, months. If you stole someone's peat or dung or bundle of dried rushes, you weren't just stealing heat, you were gambling with their life. Entire families could die from a single theft, which brings us to today's real theme, trust, or the lack of it. That afternoon, Godric takes you on a walk, more like a shuffle through slush, around the village perimeter, not for fresh air, for security. He's checking for signs that someone's been near your family's drying rack, a stick out of place, a footprint, a gap in the pile. Last year, he tells you, our neighbour lost half his patties in one night. His son didn't make it through the next week. He says it without emotion, like he's repeating something he's heard too often to still feel it. You realise quickly that in Rothford, everyone knows exactly how many fuel bricks their neighbours have. They won't admit it, but they do. They keep track, not out of spite, out of necessity. Because if someone suddenly has more than they should, or less than they should, everyone needs to know why. There's a kind of math to it. You gather X, you burn Y, you should have Z left. If not, something's wrong. And if something's wrong, it's your business. That night, you notice Elsbeth doing a second count of the fuel. She pretends she's just tidying up, but her fingers move with practiced precision. She's making sure nothing has vanished. You check too. Everything's there, for now. But even you feel it. The edge, the possibility. If it got cold enough, if the fire went out and the baby started crying and your hands couldn't stop shaking, what wouldn't you burn or take? Here's your fringe fact, by the way. There are accounts, obscure, hushed ones, from Alpine villages and Scandinavian hamlets where fuel disputes turned violent. Not just a slap or a shove, but actual deaths. One particularly unsettling story tells of a woman in 1452 who was found frozen beside her neighbour's dung pile, still clutching one patty in her hand. Whether she was stealing or returning it, no one ever agreed. But her body stayed there until spring. Back in the cottage, the fire is weak. The peat from yesterday isn't burning well, it's still too damp. So Elsbeth adds a sliver of something else. Fabric. It's an old sleeve, stained and threadbare. She tosses it in without blinking. You watch it burn and realise it was part of the shirt you saw Godric wear earlier this week. Sacrificed for heat. And no one even mourns the garment. Later, as you try to sleep, you hear something outside. Just a rustle, a footstep, maybe the wind. But it sounds human. You sit up, heart suddenly racing, ears straining. Nothing. You lie back down. Still nothing. But you sleep with one eye on the hearth. Because even in the quiet, the fire has enemies. It's gone. Not the fire, though it barely flickers now, but the stool. The little three-legged, lopsided thing you've been sitting on every night, hunched near the hearth, rubbing your hands together and pretending your fingers haven't gone numb. It's gone. You wake up, stand, and look around. Then you spot it, or what's left of it. A single leg propped in the corner, charred at one end, black as tar. You don't say anything because what is there to say? They burned the stool. You realise you didn't even hear it happen. That's how quietly things disappear in Rothford. Today's fuel is whatever you can find. And today what you find are objects that once had other lives. There's no ceremony to it, no discussion. You just watch Elsbeth take the wooden spoon that's been split for weeks and snap the handle cleanly in two. She tosses the pieces into the fire and nods like this is the natural end of a spoon's existence. You suppose it is. This is what winter does. It makes furniture into kindling, books into smoke, memories into ash. And now you've come to the part of the story where people start burning their lives. You step outside into air so cold it feels like betrayal. The snow crunches beneath your boots in a way that tells you the top layer has frozen solid, a brittle shell over deeper drifts. You walk toward the square and immediately spot something that should not be there. A hole in the side of someone's cottage. Not large, just a missing plank of wood, but it's enough. Someone's burned their wall. Tom, the same man who helped dig peat earlier, stands nearby shaking his head. They'll regret that come thaw, he mutters. Water'll pour in like a curse. But he's not judging, just acknowledging. Because they've all thought about it. Every home here is one bad night away from becoming a pile of firewood pretending to be shelter. That's the unspoken truth. Every single object in Hrothford has two identities. The one it was made for, and the one it takes on in winter. Table, firewood, crate, kindling, book. Slow burn fuel with just enough heat to boil water. And yes, books. Elsbeth has one. Had, anyway. It's a tattered religious text, nothing valuable by modern standards, mostly prayers in Latin, with a few marginal notes in a fading hand. She's kept it in a wooden box under her bed. You'd seen her touch it once, gently, like it meant something more than words. That afternoon she opens the box. The book is stiff from years of cold, the cover cracked, the spine barely holding. She doesn't cry, doesn't hesitate, just rips out a single page and feeds it to the fire. The flame jumps, bright and hungry. You feel something in your chest collapse. She offers no explanation. Here's your historical truth bomb. Burning books wasn't just an accident of war or fanatics. In many cold, poor villages across medieval Europe, especially during the harshest winters, books were fuel. Monasteries, with their endless parchment and scraps of leather binding, were sometimes raided not for knowledge, but for kindling. And while elite libraries remained protected, smaller texts, worn and unread, were easy sacrifices. There's a historical record from 1473 of a small abbey that burned its own scriptorium scraps to stay alive through a particularly cruel winter. No one talks about it. It's buried in a margin like the notes in Elspeth's book, but it happened. You wander the village, spotting other small absences. A doorframe that looks thinner than it did yesterday, a chair missing a leg, a ladder with one rung snapped off. People don't wait for objects to break, they encourage it. A wobble becomes a weakness becomes an excuse, and an excuse becomes fire. Here's your fringe fact. In times of siege or deep famine, people reportedly burned heirlooms with ritual purpose. Not out of sentimentality, but superstition. A carved figurine or old cradle might be fed to the fire in hopes it would carry a prayer with the smoke. Whether they believed it worked or not is unclear, but when you're choosing between freezing or lighting up your grandmother's spinning wheel, you find meaning anywhere. Back at Elsbeth's, the fire is stronger tonight. It smells of ink and dry wood. Godric is quiet. He's been quiet all day. You glance at the hearth and see what's feeding it now, splinters from the windowsill. You go to speak, then stop. Because really, what can you say? This is life now. The fire must be fed, and the house is full of fuel if you're brave enough to stop pretending it's home. That night, you sleep sitting up. Not by choice. There are no chairs left. Just a few overturned crates, and the crate might be next. The fire glows warmly in the dark. It lies. Because you know what's coming. When the furniture's gone, the clothing will go. When the clothing's gone, the rafters. When the rafters go, you'll be sleeping under stars you don't want to see. But for now, the fire burns, and you watch the page curl in the flame like it's praying too. The wind has changed. You don't know how exactly, but you feel it. There's a new edge in the air, sharper, crueler. It slides under doors, coils down chimneys, and gnaws at fingertips with a hunger that feels personal. Hrothford is quieter than usual this morning. Too quiet. Even the animals are subdued. The chickens haven't clucked in hours, and you haven't heard a single dog bark since dawn. Something's wrong. You head to the village square, stepping carefully over slick patches of ice that glisten like cracked glass. Everyone moves slowly, bundled and bent like they're all trying to shrink inside their own skin. Then you hear it. A thin, high-pitched whistle, almost like someone blowing over a glass bottle, but constant. A cold so deep it sings. Elsbeth calls it iron cold. The kind of cold that steals the heat from fire before it even rises. She says, when the frost bites before the sun rises and the smoke won't climb the chimney, that's iron cold. That's the kind that kills. And today, it's that kind. You look up and see it. The smoke from every chimney is hugging the roofs, curling sideways instead of rising. It has nowhere to go. The air is too dense, too heavy. The smoke settles into the village like a second skin, seeping through walls and windows, staining everything with the quiet signature of suffering. In this weather, even fire can't help you. The fire is burning. You see it. You feel the sting of it in your nose, in your throat. But your hands are still numb. Your feet feel like meat left in a freezer. Your breath clouds up and doesn't go away. It hangs in the air like fog clinging to your hair and eyelashes. The fire is there, but it's not enough. Godric's little sister Marta has stopped talking. She hasn't said a word all day. She just sits, wrapped in an old wool cloak, rocking slightly. Elsbeth tries to feed her, but she won't eat. You know the signs. You've read about this. Hypothermia doesn't always come with shivering. Sometimes it comes with silence. And then you hear it, the sound that makes everyone freeze, even in this already frozen world, the church bell. The bell never rings in winter. It's too cold for services, too risky for gathering, but when it rings, it means one thing. Someone has died. You follow the slow trail of villagers toward the chapel at the edge of the village. The path there is packed with snow, turned icy by hundreds of cautious footsteps over time. A small crowd has gathered outside. No one wants to go in yet. Not because of fear, but because the inside is colder, stone and shadow and stillness. Eventually the priest steps out. His beard is frozen, his eyes hollow. "We've lost the San family," he says. That's it. No eulogy, no comfort. Just the names. 3 people. Gone overnight. You feel it in your chest like a door closing. You'd spoken to them only days ago. They'd asked about Pete. Had been trying to trade for a few bricks. No one had any to spare. Not even Elsbeth. And now, they're gone. You return to the cottage, the silence weighing heavier than the snow. No one speaks, not even Godric. The fire is burning, but it feels distant. Weak. You sit as close as you can. Your clothes smell like everything you've burned so far. Dung, peat, old cloth, a broken spoon, and God knows what else. You rub your hands together and try to feel something. You don't. Here's a brutal historical fact. In the winter of 1316, during the Great Famine, entire villages vanished. Cold, hunger, and disease swept through Europe like a scythe. In many places, the dead outnumbered the living. Bodies were buried in shallow pits, or not at all. There are records of entire families dying overnight when fires failed and fuel ran out. Some villages never recovered. Some were simply reclaimed by snow. There's a scholarly debate about whether this winter, the kind Hrothford is trapped in now, was an anomaly or part of the broader climatic downturn known as the Little Ice Age. Some argue it was the result of volcanic activity. Others point to a solar minimum. Regardless, it was enough to break the fragile systems medieval communities relied on. The weather changed, and the world with it. Fringe fact, during some of the coldest winters, people reported ice ghosts. Not literal spirits, but hallucinations brought on by cold, hunger, and sleep deprivation. Villagers would see figures in the snow, people they'd lost, animals long dead, flickering lights in the trees. Entire folktales were born from these hallucinations. Some thought the cold carried voices. And when you're sitting in a frozen cottage with your breath hanging in front of you like mist, you start to believe it. That night, the fire barely burns. There's nothing left to feed it except a handful of damp peat and a strip of old leather. Elsbeth tears it from a shoe that doesn't fit anyone anymore. It smoulders with a smell like burnt hair and wet dog. The room fills with smoke that doesn't rise. It just coils around your legs, thick and grey and sad. You lie down on the straw mat, Marta curled beside you like a small animal, Elspeth murmuring prayers too softly to understand. Godric stares at the fire like he's trying to make a deal with it. And outside, the wind screams like it's trying to peel the world apart. You don't sleep. You just wait to see who makes it through the night. The morning doesn't come so much as it creeps in, an indifferent smear of grey light dragging itself across the sky, like it's just as exhausted as you are. You wake to silence again, but a different kind. Not the deathly hush of the San family's last breath. No. This one is focused, busy, like the calm just before something weirdly productive. The air is thick with cold and smoke. You cough before you even open your eyes. Someone's already up. You hear clinking, scraping, the gentle slosh of liquid. You rise slowly, bones cracking like old kindling, and find Elsbeth hunched over the hearth, not feeding it this time but boiling something. A pot of cloudy water, thick with steam and the unmistakable sour smell of barley and yeast. It hits you instantly. Ale. She glances up and motions you over. "Today we brew," she says simply. You blink at her. You're not even sure what day it is, but apparently it's one of the most important days on the peasant calendar. Ale brewing day. And not because anyone's looking to party. In Rothford, ale isn't about drinking. It's about surviving. You settle next to the fire and watch the process unfold. Godric carries in buckets of murky water from the well, each one freezing at the edges before he can even make it to the door. Elsbeth checks the heat of the coals, low, slow, controlled. She adds barley mash, stirs, waits. Then she tosses in dried herbs, poor man's hops basically, and continues stirring, muttering under her breath. The house smells like wet bread and smoke. You kind of hate it, and also love it. You ask why she's doing this now when fuel is almost gone and everyone's weak from cold. She looks up, eyebrows raised. Because we have to. You can go a week without food, but only days without drink. And we don't drink the well water unless we have to. That's the key historical insight. In much of medieval Europe, water wasn't safe. Wells were shallow, often near animal pens, and full of microbes that would make modern stomachs turn inside out. So people brewed ale, weak, often barely alcoholic, but boiled and fermented just enough to kill the nastiest stuff. Children drank it. The sick drank it. Monks drank it. It was hydration in liquid form, nutrition too when done right. So yes, Elsbeth is using the last of her barley to make a batch of what she calls small ale. Not for fun, for life. Godric brings in more fuel, a half patty of dung, some brittle roots, and a piece of wood so dry it looks like a bone. They add it all to the fire and continue stirring the brew. You help skim the foam, toss in a handful of dried nettles and stir the cloudy mess until your arms ache. It's not pretty, and it definitely doesn't smell like a pub, but it's working. Slowly, steadily, the fire simmers the mash, and the room warms up more than it has in days. Elsbeth uses an old linen cloth to strain the liquid, then pours it into ceramic jugs lined with wax. The rest will ferment for a day or two, just enough to be drinkable by week's end. They'll water it down and ration it like gold. You think about how beer is treated in your world. Happy hour, tailgates, expensive taps and seasonal flights and trivia nights. Here, it's medicine, water purification, liquid calories. The scholarly debate around this is actually lively, at least in the medieval fluids niche of academia. Some argue that the role of ale in daily peasant life is exaggerated, that water wasn't always dangerous, and people knew how to avoid bad wells. Others insist small ale was essential, especially in colder climates where contamination was common, and boiling water purely for drinking was wasteful. The truth, as always, lies in the middle. But in Hrothford, the truth is steam rising off a barley pot in a frozen house, where even prayer feels like wasted breath. There's also a curious fringe theory that some of the most tightly knit medieval communities weren't built around churches or markets, but brewhouses, not taverns, but communal ale brewing operations run out of cottages or barns. Brewing was labour-intensive and consumed a ton of fuel, so people often did it in small collectives. These local ale circles shared ingredients, recipes, even fire. In a weird way, they were early mutual aid networks. Boiled together, survived together. Elsbeth doesn't mention community today. She just works in silence, siphoning the pale brown liquid into stoppered jugs and setting them near the hearth to stay warm. Each jug is wrapped in cloth like a baby. You help stack them beside the fire where they'll ferment slowly. Then she gives you a mug. It's warm, not hot, not fresh, but the last bit from the pot. You take a cautious sip, expecting bitterness or rot, but it's surprisingly smooth, earthy, faintly sour and oddly comforting. It tastes like survival. Marta, who hasn't spoken in 2 days, takes a sip from Elsbeth's mug and whispers, "Warm." Just one word. But it might be the most important one spoken all week. That night the fire is stronger, not because you have more fuel, but because you have something to do. Brewing gave the day shape, gave the cold less room to creep in. Everyone smells like barley and smoke and boiled cloth, but no one complains. You lie down near the hearth, belly faintly full, blood warmer than it was, sleepier than you expected. The snow falls quietly outside, tapping the roof like a visitor who's forgotten how to knock. The jugs rest beside you, wrapped tight, fermenting like secrets. Tomorrow, the cold will still be there, but tonight, your breath isn't fogging in front of your face, and that's enough to call this a victory. It's hard to believe your feet are on ice, not the usual crusted snow or muddy slush. Real ice, thick, blue, polished by wind and time until it looks like glass stretching to the horizon. You walk slowly, hesitantly, boots sliding a little with each step, trying not to fall and crack your tailbone in front of a crowd of medieval children who somehow seem to have the balance of mountain goats. One of them glides past you like it's no big deal, arms out, scarf flying behind him like a banner of mockery. You're watching what can only be described as the medieval version of a party, right here on a frozen river. It's surreal. After weeks of grim silence, burning shoes, crying babies, and counting cow patties like gold coins, you've stumbled into something that doesn't feel like survival. It feels like celebration, a winter fair. The river, which has been frozen solid for over a week now, has become more than just an obstacle. It's become a stage. People have carved walkways through the snow, lined them with sticks and lanterns. Someone's hung strips of colourful cloth between poles. A handful of traders from nearby villages have come dragging sleds loaded with dried goods, pottery, even a few precious metal tools. There's a woman selling roasted turnips on a flat stone heated by coals, and they smell shockingly edible. You spot Elsbeth and Godric near the edge of the fair, eyeing a bartering stand. Elsbeth looks sceptical, which makes sense. This is the same woman who once haggled for dried fish with the intensity of a wartime general. She gestures for you to come closer. "It's not just a market," she mutters, watching the scene. "It's a distraction." She's not wrong, because while there's music, rudimentary flutes, clapping, someone tapping rhythmically on a pot lid, and there's laughter and games and things being sold that no one can actually afford, there's also a sense that everyone's trying really, really hard not to remember that it's 20 degrees and death is one cracked chimney away. People dance to stay warm. They smile to stay sane. Here's your historical nugget. Frost fairs weren't just something that happened in London on the Thames. Throughout Europe, when rivers froze solid enough, even peasant villages found ways to gather. It was rare, because rivers don't freeze safely very often, but when it happened, it was seen as both omen and opportunity. The cold that took lives also created moments of eerie stability. Flat solid ground where there hadn't been before, a place for trade, for socialising, for escaping the cramped stink of a one-room cottage full of smoke and coughing. Of course, not everyone agrees on how widespread these fairs were. Some say they were limited to large towns with big rivers. Others argue small communities made their own versions, usually without tents or printed souvenir cards. Just people on ice, hoping they wouldn't fall through. Back on the river, Godric challenges you to a sliding race. You hesitate. You've seen enough cracked skulls in movies, thank you very much. But the look in his eyes, a spark of the boy he probably was before the hunger set in, makes it hard to say no. So you do it. You run, you slide, and you immediately wipe out on your side like a sack of onions. Godric howls with laughter and declares himself the king of the ice. Someone nearby claps. For just a second, it doesn't feel like the 14th century. It feels like life. Elsbeth buys 2 half loaves of stale rye bread with a single iron spoon and a strip of cloth. She doesn't seem to think it was a fair deal, but she accepts it anyway. Godric grabs a roasted turnip from a fire pit run by a woman with the blackened fingers of frostbite. You trade one of your wool socks for a pouch of dried apple slices. It was already unravelling. Worth it. The fire pits scattered along the ice are fueled by anything people could drag here. Brush, peat, straw, broken tools. You even see one pit that's clearly burning the remains of a sled that didn't survive the journey. You squat beside it and listen to an old man explain how he once saw the river freeze. So solid, they drove a cart full of pigs across it. He might be lying. You choose to believe him. Here's your fringe fact of the day. Some people believed frozen rivers were sacred, that when a river stopped moving, the spirits inside it became trapped and vulnerable. So during frost fairs or river gatherings, some folks tossed in offerings, coins, bits of food, even bits of hair or blood. Superstition. Sure, but when you're walking on a surface that could become water again at any moment, You're willing to hedge your bets. As the light fades, the fair begins to unravel. The music grows quieter, the laughter thinner. People begin heading home, dragging their sleds behind them, breath clouding in the dusk. Elsbeth holds Marta close, both bundled in layers of threadbare wool and borrowed fur. Godric skips ahead, energised by sugar he probably hasn't tasted in a month. You walk home on the river, not because it's faster, but because you can, because it won't always be frozen, and because part of you wants to stay out here forever, where there's music and turnips and the illusion that everything's fine. By the time you reach the cottage, your toes are numb again, your hands raw, but you're carrying something in your arms, a loaf of bread, a pouch of apples, and 3 little peat bricks bought off a wandering trader with half a rabbit's pelt. A good haul. That night, Elsbeth makes stew from bone scraps and rye bread. You sit close to the fire, now slightly stronger thanks to new fuel. Godric talks about how he nearly beat you by a mile in the race. Marta says nothing, but she smiles. Outside, the river is silent again, moonlight glinting off its icy surface. Tomorrow the ice might crack, the cold might return harder. But tonight you danced on a river and lived to tell the tale. The fire's gone out again, not because you ran out of fuel, though you're not far from that point, but because everyone fell asleep too fast to notice it was dying. The fair took more out of you than you expected. Laughter, turns out, is expensive. You wake in darkness, the kind of darkness that eats sound. No wind, no fire, no light. Just the sharp cold crawling under your blanket like it's looking for a place to hide. You sit up slowly, careful not to wake Godric or Marta, both curled like kittens under the same fur. Elsbeth's already up, moving through the room with silent urgency. Her breath fogs in front of her as she unwraps a candle stub, lights it with a flint spark and sets it in the hearth. It gives off barely enough light to see your own hands. The hearth itself is empty save for grey ash and a few pitiful black flecks. You rub your hands together out of habit, but even the friction feels frozen. Without a word, Elsbeth leaves the room and returns a few moments later, holding something precious in her arms. A bundle of waxy cloth and string. Candles, 3 of them. You stare, not out of reverence, but shock. This is wealth. In Hrothford, these aren't just for light. They're heat, trade, status, and, on occasion, hope. She unwraps one and sets it beside the cold hearth, not lighting it yet. "Church tonight," she says softly. "They're opening it. Everyone's going." You blink. The idea of leaving the house at night in this cold seems absurd, but Elsbeth doesn't waver. She passes you a cracked wooden bowl and nods toward the table. "Bring something. Doesn't matter what." You glance down. You have half a turnip, a fistful of barley, and a crust of bread harder than brick. You wrap it all in cloth and follow her out into the dark. The walk to the church is slow and deliberate. The snow crunches like sugar underfoot, each step a prayer that you don't slip. You pass neighbours, silhouettes in cloaks and wool, all moving in the same direction. Silent, steady. No one talks. No one wants to lose breath to the cold. The church stands at the far end of the village, small and simple. Stone walls, thatch roof, and one narrow tower. It looks older than time itself. Its wooden door is cracked open, and light spills out in a golden blur. Inside it's dim but warmer than expected. Candles line the altar, the windowsills, even the tops of the pews. You count at least 20 flames dancing in the air, each one a contribution, a sacrifice. You find a place near the back. Elspeth kneels beside you. Godric fidgets. Marta leans against her mother, face half asleep. A hush falls over the room as the priest steps forward. Not in grand robes, just a simple wool tunic patched and threadbare. He looks more like a farmer than a clergyman. Maybe he is. He doesn't speak at first, just stares at the flames. Then softly he says, "This is how we endure." The sermon, if you can call it that, is short. No promises of spring. No sermons about sin or salvation. Just stories. Memories. Who was lost this week? Who is still here? What was burned to make it through the night? A stool, a Bible, a cradle. Then everyone adds something to the offering table. You walk up with your turnip crust and place it gently beside someone else's onion peel, a wooden button, a tattered ribbon. These are not symbolic gifts. These are real things people need. And yet they give them anyway, because when everything else fails, sometimes ritual is all you've got. Historically speaking, churches were often the warmest buildings in a medieval village, ironically not because of divine heat, but because they were built better. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, and fewer gaps meant they held warmth longer. During severe winters, they became sanctuaries in the truest sense, not for prayer, but for shelter. Services sometimes doubled as communal warming events. Not every lord approved, but not every lord lived in the village with the people who froze. You've stumbled into one of those quiet traditions, half religion, half survival strategy, one that historians still argue about. Were medieval churches actively used as heat shelters, or was that an occasional exception? Some say it depended on the priest. Others say it depended on how much the villagers were willing to push their luck. Tonight no one's asking permission. They're just here, gathered around 20 flickering flames and the warmth of each other's breath. Fringe fact of the night. In certain remote villages, people believed candle flames could predict death. If the wick burned too quickly, it meant someone nearby wouldn't make it to spring. If it sputtered and hissed, a spirit was present. Tonight, you watch the candles like a weather vane for your own fate. One burns low and steady, another flickers. You try not to assign meaning, but it's hard. After the service, no one rushes home. People linger. Some fall asleep in pews. Others huddle in corners, passing flasks, sharing gossip, biting into crusts that weren't placed on the offering table. It's not reverent. It's not holy. It's just human. You find yourself next to the priest who hands you a cup of something warm, likely a bit of ale watered down with something herbal. It tastes bitter and earthy. He doesn't ask your name, just says, "The cold doesn't care who you are, so we stay close." Eventually, Elsbeth gathers the children, wraps them tighter in their cloaks, and leads you home. The fire in the cottage has long gone out, but the warmth from the church clings to your skin like perfume. You curl up on the straw mat with Marta, who's already dozing. Godric sighs like he's just come back from a long journey. Elspeth lights one of the new candles, just one. She sets it in the hearth, and it glows brighter than you expect, just enough to see the frost on the windows and the shadows it casts. You fall asleep watching the flame, trying not to wonder how quickly it might burn down. By the next morning, the candle has melted into a puddle of wax and soot in the hearth, a faint little ring marking where its base once stood. Its light is gone, but the air still holds a ghost of warmth, like a story you just woke up from and can't quite remember. Outside, snow has fallen again, heavy this time, thick enough to bend the wooden slats of the goat pen. The entire village looks like it's been blanketed in white silence. The paths you walked yesterday have vanished, swallowed up under a fresh, even layer of winter's latest opinion. Today, you're not going out to find fuel. Today, you're staying in to make insulation. You didn't even realise that was an option. But Elspeth assures you it is, just not the way you're used to. There's no foam spray or fiberglass rolls. No little pink bunny with a smug grin. Just moss, mud, manure, straw, and a whole lot of patience. It starts with the cracks. Elspeth crouches by the base of the wall, poking a wooden sliver into a gap between the daub and the timber. A frigid breeze sneaks through it, and you suddenly understand why your breath has been clouding indoors for days. She sends you and Godric out with burlap sacks to collect whatever moss you can find under the trees and rocks near the edge of the village. It's wet, frozen, slimy, but it's insulation. You return, numb from the knees down, and help smear the moss, now mashed and mixed with bits of dung, into the gaps between the wall planks. It squishes into place with a soft, stomach-turning squelch. You want to complain, but then the wind outside rattles the roof and you think, better moss than frostbite. Elsbeth works quickly. She's done this before. Every year, in fact. Most of the homes in Rothford aren't insulated so much as patched. Mud packed into walls, animal hair stuffed between rafters, old tunics nailed over windows. She even tacks a piece of boiled leather across the lower part of the doorframe. Windproofing, she says, when she notices your raised eyebrows. Here's your historical nugget. Medieval insulation was, to put it mildly, a bit of a mess. Wattle and daub homes were structurally decent but hopeless when it came to warmth. People relied on passive insulation techniques, low ceilings, small rooms, shared body heat, and constant maintenance. Walls were smeared with mixtures of clay, straw, lime, and manure. That's not a joke or a metaphor, that's a literal blend of ingredients. Why? Because dried manure provided binding and surprisingly decent insulation. It was also free and available in volumes you really don't want to think too hard about. But it wasn't just walls. Floors were covered in rushes, thick bundles of reeds or straw laid down to trap warmth, and yes, every other thing that might fall through the cracks. These weren't changed often. Sometimes just added to, layer after grimy layer. A few noble homes had heated stone floors, called hippocausts, or hanging tapestries to reduce draughts, but in villages like Hrothford, you used what you had: moss, mud, and goat hair. Godric and Marta helped stuff clumps of dirty straw into the space beneath the window. It's barely a window by modern standards, just a square hole covered with stretched bladder or thin horn. Light comes through, but not warmth. You notice the edge of the frame is damp, slick with frost. Godric, grinning like this is just another chore, seals it with a thick wad of sheep wool that's seen better days. The smell is specific. You help Elsbeth hang another thick cloth over the entryway. It's scratchy, made of matted wool and patches from old cloaks. She sews it into place right over the doorframe. It won't stop the cold, not entirely, but it'll slow it down. And that's the trick here. Not defeating the cold, just slowing it, distracting it, giving yourself a few extra degrees before it creeps back in. Here's your fringe fact. Some historical accounts suggest people even used dried seaweed as insulation, particularly in coastal villages, stuffed into walls, packed around bedding, even layered beneath floorboards. It was cheap, abundant, and surprisingly effective. It also smelled like rotting fish for the first few days. After that, people just stopped noticing, or pretended to. As the day wears on, your fingers go numb, thaw, go numb again. Your sleeves stiffen with frozen mud. The back of your throat burns from breathing in dust and smoke and dung particles. And somehow, despite all that, the house does feel warmer. The wind rattles, but it doesn't slice through the walls anymore. The drafts have become breezes. The floor doesn't feel like it's trying to steal your soul through your feet. You sit beside the hearth, watching the patchwork wall breathe gently in the wind. It looks hideous, lumpy, discoloured, uneven, but it holds, and that's all anyone's asking. That night, with the new insulation in place, the fire doesn't have to work as hard. A single peat brick, a few twigs, and a twist of rags are enough to keep the room from freezing. The air still smells like a barn that lost a bet, but it's tolerable. You eat thin barley porridge, now thickened with old bits of bread and crushed beans, and find that the spoon doesn't sting your lips with cold anymore. A win. Marta falls asleep first, curled beneath a fur so small she has to tuck her knees to her chest. Godric, yawning, says the wall looks like the side of a very sick pig. Elsbeth chuckles. You all laugh a little too hard, but maybe that's the point. Anything that isn't crying is worth overdoing. You lie down, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket that smells faintly of ash and something you can't name. You listen to the wind outside, not howling, not raging, just brushing past the cottage like it's been defeated for now. You close your eyes, and for the first time in days, you don't feel the cold climbing up your spine. You just feel still. You wake to a strange sound, not coughing, not clanging, not the wind clawing at the roof, but something much quieter, more deliberate. Feet, bare ones, sneaking, shifting on straw. You hold your breath and listen. The fire is low, barely a red glow in the hearth, and the shadows stretch long across the room. It's still the dead of night. You sit up slowly, quietly, and see a shape moving near the wall. Small, fast, Godric. He doesn't see you watching, not at first. He's crouched near the stash behind the firewood pile, the real fuel stash, the last good bricks of dried dung, the ones Elsbeth set aside to get you through the next week. He pulls one out with both hands, cradling it like it might scream, and tiptoes toward the door. You say his name. He freezes, turns slowly. His eyes are wide, not with fear exactly, but shame. You say nothing else, neither does he. You both stand there, suspended in the thick silence of a cottage not quite warm enough to justify anything, not cold enough to excuse it. He swallows finally. I wasn't going far. You nod. He opens the door a crack and slips out. You wait. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Then you follow him. Outside, the village is dark but not empty. Shadows move between houses. Figures wrapped in cloaks and fur, carrying small bundles, dragging carts that don't squeak because their wheels are wrapped in cloth. They move like ghosts, efficient, cautious, determined. You follow Godric through the snow to the back of the tanner's shed, where a small fire burns behind a low stone wall. 3 others are there, young boys, maybe a year older than Godric. One's feeding twigs into the flame. Another stirs something in a cracked pot. It smells vaguely of roots and salt. Maybe soup, maybe soap. Hard to tell in this light. Godric kneels and offers his single dung brick like a treasure. They nod their thanks without speaking. You stay in the shadows, watching, feeling a mix of admiration and fury. This is the fuel war Elsbeth warned you about. Back in the cottage, she told you stories of how neighbours used to steal from each other in the night. At first, it was just desperation. 1 brick, 1 bundle. Then people got bold. Whole racks of peat disappeared. Fences were torn apart for kindling. One family even lost their floorboards. It reached a point where villagers started marking their fuel piles with carvings, runes, crosses, family symbols. Not to deter thieves, but to make it known who owned what. So if something went missing, everyone knew who to blame. And when the thefts kept happening anyway, they started watching, setting traps, assigning guards, children with slings, dogs trained to bark at the scent of manure that wasn't theirs. You've stumbled into this world of quiet, cold warfare. And the craziest part, no one talks about it, not in the open, because everyone's guilty eventually. Godric's back before dawn. The fire still burns. No one asks where he went. You both pretend nothing happened, but that day you notice things. One of the drying racks near the well has collapsed. Someone stepped on it or kicked it or maybe just didn't care anymore. A man argues with his neighbour about a broken latch on his shed, claims someone was inside. The neighbour shrugs, says he saw nothing. You believe neither of them. At the edge of the village, a dung pile has gone missing entirely. Just gone, as if it stood up and walked off in the night. Elsbeth doesn't say much, but when she checks the stash, her lips go thin. 2 bricks missing. She doesn't ask. She just gathers more straw and manure from the goat pen and begins moulding new patties by hand. She's done it 100 times. You can tell. She presses the mix into perfect discs, pats them flat, and lines them on a rack to dry near the fire. They'll be ready in 3 days. Maybe. You help, because now you understand. Here's your historical truth bomb. Theft among medieval peasants wasn't rare. It was routine. The line between sharing and stealing blurred fast when survival was involved. Entire village courts were filled with petty complaints. Missing firewood, tools, animals, even food. Fuel-related disputes were especially intense. Dung theft could get you beaten. Peat poaching could get you fined. And in some regions, chronic wood thieves were branded or exiled. There's even an odd little record from 1321 where a man accused his own brother of stealing dried manure during a particularly brutal frost. The court ruled that, yes, it was theft. The penalty: return the patties or equivalent in heat, which meant giving up his own stash. The judge included a note: let not the cold make liars of us all. Then there's the fringe story. In one northern village it's said that people marked their dung piles with human teeth, left over from burial grounds. A gruesome warning: steal this, and may the dead follow you home. The tale is likely apocryphal, but in a world where fire is life and dung is fire, you start to understand how desperate people might get. Back in the cottage, you and Godric sit by the hearth as Elsbeth rests, her hands finally still. You don't ask about the brick. He doesn't confess, but he does offer you the warmer corner of the straw mat. It's not an apology. It's something quieter. That night, you fall asleep wondering what's more dangerous, the cold outside, or the choices it makes people consider, and you dream of brick-shaped shadows slipping through moonlight. You don't expect to be cold inside a church. Then again, you also didn't expect to be here, hunched over a desk beside a shivering monk who's furiously scraping a quill across parchment like he's racing the Reaper himself. The air smells of beeswax, old wood, ink and damp wool. And mildew. Always mildew. You didn't know mildew had a temperature until now. Turns out it's just above freezing and smells faintly like defeat. Brother Caelan doesn't even look up when you sit beside him. His nose is red, his eyes leaking at the corners, and his breath fogs with every exhale. You'd say he's focused, but it's more like possessed. His hand trembles as he writes, not from fear, but from pure, unfiltered cold. Every few lines he pauses to flex his fingers and warm them over a miserably small candle stub. It does almost nothing. You could blow it out just by blinking too hard. Welcome to the monastery's scriptorium, the world's coldest room full of the world's most flammable things. You came here with Elsbeth to deliver a sack of dried nettles and a half-brick of peat to the monks, an offering of sorts. In exchange, they let Godric borrow a broken spade and offered you a look at their prized work, copied texts, drawn illuminations, and presumably frostbitten spiritual enlightenment. The scriptorium is the size of a small stable, and just as cosy. Its stone walls sweat with condensation. Thin windows let in exactly 0 warmth. Every surface is covered in scraps, parchment, tools, pigments, and failed attempts. The fire in the corner is little more than a symbolic pile of coals pretending to do its job. One monk is writing with gloves on, the fingertips cut away. Another has tied a scarf around his face and mumbles prayers like they're going to turn into warmth if he says them fast enough. You sit and watch Caelan continue his work. He's copying a religious tract, something about saints and frost and eternal virtue. You can barely read it, but you recognise the rhythm of repetition. His ink freezes at the tip of the quill twice. Each time he dips it back into the pot with the irritated sigh of a man who's truly over it. At one point he hands you a small knife and gestures toward a curled sheet of parchment. "Scrape it," he croaks. "Ice." And you do. You scrape a literal layer of frost off the page. That's a new one for your resume. Historically speaking, monasteries were supposed to be sanctuaries of learning, warmth and discipline. But in winters like this, they were just as miserable as any peasant hut, sometimes worse. The stone walls trapped cold, the silence became oppressive, and the pressure to keep copying sacred texts without ruining them with shaking hands or inkblots was relentless. Some records from 14th century monasteries mention entire days lost to frozen fingers. One even notes that a scribe died mid-sentence, quill still in hand, frozen over his desk. You glance at Caelan, who sneezes into his sleeve with a wet, defeated honk. You believe it. There's a particular bit of monk trivia you won't find in many textbooks. They used to warm their ink pots over candle flames, risking spills and fires just to keep the ink moving. In desperate times, they'd hold parchment to their chests to thaw it before writing, even if it meant smudging what they'd already copied. Some wore fingerless gloves, others used rabbit skins as hand wraps. Anything to keep writing, anything to finish one more page. You ask Caelan why they don't just stop for winter. He looks at you with the hollow eyes of someone who's heard that question too many times. "Because the word doesn't wait," he says, "and neither does Lord Halric." Ah, there it is. The noble's order. Halric apparently wants a new prayer book completed by spring, and he wants it fancy, illuminated capitals, red ink, gold leaf. Which is hilarious, because the gold leaf froze into a sheet last week and cracked. But try telling that to a man who lives uphill with a roaring birchwood fire and freshly salted venison. One of the younger monks breaks the tip of his stylus and curses softly. Caelan glares, then sighs. Scripture first, frustration second. The boy nods and returns to work, his fingers trembling visibly. You wonder how many of these pages will survive the winter, and how many monks won't. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much winter conditions truly slowed medieval writing. Some argue that scribes simply paused during the worst months. Others insist the copying continued, frost or no frost, especially in monasteries under noble pressure. The debate ignores the human element, the fact that these were people. Cold, hungry, exhausted people who sometimes dropped ink on sacred texts because their hands just stopped working. The fringe fact of the day. In at least one documented case, a monk added a margin note that simply reads, "Too cold, fingers like dead pigs." It's still there, in a manuscript kept in a cathedral archive. No one erased it, maybe out of respect. As the day darkens, the room grows colder. The fire in the corner finally gives up and becomes a pile of sulking ash. Caelan curses quietly in Latin, then in very non-Latin. He caps his inkwell and gently closes the manuscript. "Enough," he says. "We'll pretend this day never existed." You help them pack up the tools, the candles, the frostbitten pages. The youngest monk falls asleep slumped over a desk. No one moves him. Back outside, Elsbeth is waiting. She doesn't ask how it went, just nods and turns toward home. Godric follows, dragging the repaired spade. The cold has gone from sharp to numb. Your breath hangs low, sluggish. You don't speak on the walk back. That night, you sit by the hearth and look at your own hands. They're raw, red, stiff. You imagine trying to write by candlelight with ink that's frozen in the pot. You can't. The fire pops. A small coal leaps out. Godric presses it back in with a stick like he's done it 1,000 times. You wonder how many books were never written because someone couldn't feel their fingers, and how many monks dreamed of burning their own manuscripts, just for the heat. The lice are winning. You're not sure when the war began, but sometime between week 2 and your 3rd night wearing the same wool tunic to bed, they must have launched a full-scale invasion. You scratch absent-mindedly at your scalp and feel something move. Tiny, fast, determined. You suppress a shudder. Across the room, Godric is also scratching. Elsbeth doesn't even bother hiding it. She just tugs her headscarf tighter and keeps scrubbing a pot near the fire like this is just another Thursday. This is the side of the winter survival no one puts in storybooks. The slow, itchy, festering deterioration of your own body. Not from battle, not from plague, not from anything epic or cinematic. Just from being too cold to wash. Today is all about layers. Not just the physical ones, the wool shirts, the stitched together rags, the cloaks that smell like damp goats, but the mental layers you wrap around yourself to pretend you're fine. You're not. No one is. But if you think about it too much, you'll lose your mind. Elsbeth throws a pair of breeches at you. They're stiff, heavy and patchy, with at least 4 different shades of wool. You hold them up like you're examining modern art. "Put them on under your skirt," she says. "Or on top of it. Doesn't matter. Just more." And so begins your induction into the great medieval fashion technique of just keep adding things until you stop feeling pain. First, the linen shift you've worn for weeks. Then a second one. Slightly damp, but who's counting? Then the breeches. Then a tunic. Then a wool overdress. 2 cloaks, 2 hoods. Mittens made from cut-up fur scraps that smell faintly like their previous owner. You feel like a poorly taxidermied bear. Walking becomes a chore. Sitting down is practically a commitment. But for the first time in days, you don't feel the chill in your bones. Until, of course, the lice start squirming again. You try not to think about it. No one talks about it, but it's everywhere. Every household, every bedroll, every collar seam. The warmth that keeps you alive also makes the lice thrive. They're smart little beasts. They know where the blood flows close to the skin, behind your ears, under your arms, inside your boots, and they multiply. Mercilessly. Here's your historical fact to pair with that mental image. Lice weren't just common in the medieval world, they were practically guaranteed. Everyone had them. Rich, poor, holy, heretic. Nobles shaved their heads and wore wigs partly to deal with them. Peasants just lived with it. The term nitpicking comes from literally picking lice eggs. Nits out of hair, strand by strand. Delousing was a group activity. Intimate, necessary, gross. You witness this firsthand when you visit the Weaver's family across the lane. They've set up a delousing station near the hearth. A bench, 2 candles, and a wide-toothed comb carved from bone. The children sit still while their mother works through their hair with the intensity of a woman who has had enough. The lice drop into a bowl of vinegar, which sizzles slightly in the heat. One child cries. The others stare blankly ahead like tiny soldiers enduring the world's weirdest battle. You try to help. You really do. But within 5 minutes your eyes are watering from the smoke, your fingers are numb, and you've dropped the comb 3 times. The weaver laughs and hands you a bit of cloth soaked in ashes and fat. Homemade louse repellent. It smells like sadness and soap. You smear it into your hair like shame. Let's talk about wool for a second. It itches. You know that. Everyone knows that. But what you don't know until you've worn 6 layers of it is how it rubs. Under your arms, at the base of your neck, behind your knees. You chafe in places you didn't know existed. And once it gets damp from sweat, yes, even in the cold, you're left with wet, itchy misery pressed, directly against your skin for hours. You think about cotton, but that's a luxury most villagers have never even heard of. Linen is better, but thin, fragile. It tears in the cold. And leather? Well, leather stiffens in low temp and smells like wet dog when it gets too close to the fire. Still, clothing is currency. A well-mended cloak is worth its weight in oats. A pair of boots, even patched beyond reason, can be the difference between frostbite and walking home with all your toes. Godric treasures his gloves like they're relics. He wears them to sleep, tucked into his belt during the day. You watch him spit into his hands and rub them together just to soften the inside a little before putting them on. There's scholarly debate over just how layered medieval peasants really were. Some accounts suggest 4 or 5 layers in winter. Others insist most couldn't afford that much cloth. But what's clear is this. People wore everything they owned when the temperature dropped. Clothes were slept in, sweated in, frozen in. You weren't dressing for fashion, you were dressing for war. Fringe fact? In certain mountain villages, children were sewn into their winter clothes. Literally. Parents stitched the hems shut and didn't open them again until spring. It kept the heat in, and the kids didn't fight back. Of course, it also meant bath time was rare. You're not even sure if it still counts as hygiene at that point or just textile entombment. Back in Elsbeth's house, the fire is holding steady. The new insulation is helping. The walls no longer breathe cold air, just cold judgment. Elsbeth sits on her stool, what's left of it, and works a needle through a patch for Marta's mittens. Godric lies on the floor with his boots off, wiggling toes that look suspiciously blue around the edges. You gently slide another blanket over him. You try to scratch your scalp discreetly, but Elsbeth sees. She raises one eyebrow. You sigh. Lice, you admit. She nods, pulls a small comb from her apron, and pats the floor in front of her. You don't argue. That night, you fall asleep with your head itching, your sleeves bunching under your arms, and the smell of vinegar still stinging your nose. But you're warm, and that counts for everything. You're woken this time not by wind or scratching, or the muffled sobs of someone praying into their blanket, but by heat. Real heat. Not just the half-hearted warmth of smouldering dung, or a sullen peat brick giving off more smoke than flame. No, this is rich, alive, almost human heat. You sit up, momentarily disoriented. For once your breath doesn't fog in front of your face. Your fingers don't ache. Your feet feel, dare you say it, almost sweaty. You look around the room for the miracle source of this warmth, and then you hear it. The low rhythmic grunts, the shuffling, the rustle of straw. You're not alone in the room. Well, you are. But not in the human sense. Elsbeth's brought the cow inside. You stare. The cow stares back. She's huddled in the corner on a thick bed of straw, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded like she's personally responsible for saving this entire household and knows it. "You're welcome," Elsbeth mutters, without looking up from where she's patching yet another mitten. "We've always done it, just not this early." You notice the goat too. Smaller, quieter, somehow more apologetic about being indoors. It's curled beside the hearth like a dog, its hooves tucked neatly beneath its body, chewing on what looks suspiciously like a piece of someone's belt. No one stops it. And now you've reached that stage of medieval winter survival. Warmth by livestock. It makes sense, if you think about it. Which, to be fair, you're trying not to. The body heat from even a single cow is significant. A full-grown cow can radiate enough warmth to raise the temperature of a small enclosed space by a few degrees. Not enough to roast marshmallows, but enough to keep your blood from turning to slush in your veins. The smell, of course, is a problem. It's not bad per se, not after everything else you've inhaled over the past weeks, but it is constant. Earthy, sweet, damp, like a stable in your lungs. The cottage is already smoky, already heavy with the smell of wet wool and body odour, So adding two large animals into the mix doesn't so much worsen the air as it completely surrenders it. Godric rolls over under the blanket, rubbing his face. He doesn't even blink at the sight of the cow, just mutters, "Is she warm?" and then curls back up. Elsbeth explains that this used to be common. The cow was always the last line of defence. You brought her in when the temperature dropped too low or when you'd burned everything else but the roof. A few chickens, maybe a goat or two if you were lucky, but the cow, she was the prized furnace. Here's your historical hit for the day. In many medieval homes, especially in colder climates, it was completely normal to share living quarters with animals. Often, the house and the barn weren't separate buildings at all. They were longhouses or byre dwellings, with the humans at one end and the animals at the other. Sometimes divided by nothing more than a low wall or a plank of wood. The heat from the animals helped regulate the temperature. Plus, it kept your most valuable assets safe, from thieves and from the cold. But it was also, well, gross. Parasites, smells, disease. Some lords outlawed the practice when outbreaks occurred. Others didn't care, as long as taxes got paid. Scholars still argue about how common this cohabitation really was. Some claim it was only in the poorest regions. Others say it was widespread. The archaeological evidence, barnyard bones found inside house foundations, leans toward, yes, it happened a lot. You shuffle over to the hearth, careful not to step in anything fresh. The cow shifts slightly, and the air warms by, 1/2 degree. Elsbeth hands you a small flatbread, slightly stale but softened over the embers. You eat it slowly, savouring the warmth in your belly. Then you notice Marta, still asleep, nestled so close to the goat you'd think they were littermates. The animal doesn't seem to mind. In fact, it occasionally nudges her with its snout as if checking to see if she's still breathing. Godric stirs and gets up to milk the cow. The process is fast and quiet. No drama. The bucket comes back half full. Warm, foamy, vaguely grassy in smell. Elsbeth hands you a cup without asking. You sip. It's the richest thing you've tasted in weeks. Not quite sweet, not quite sour. Just real and warm. That matters most. A few hours later, you help spread new straw across the floor. The old straw is damp, rank. Part of you wants to burn it, but the rest of you knows better. Wet straw is more likely to smother a fire than feed it. So you stuff it into a bin and hope it'll dry enough to be useful later. You look around the room. It's not a home anymore. It's a barn with ambition. Blankets over windows, dung in the corner, livestock staring at you while you eat. And somehow, you're grateful for it. Because now, for the first time in days, your feet aren't numb. Fringe fact. In some Scandinavian and Alpine traditions, villagers believed animals could speak on Christmas Eve. Just for 1 hour, when the veil between the sacred and the earthly thinned. It was considered bad luck to overhear them, though. Some said you'd die within the year. Others claimed you'd go mad. You watch the cow as it blinks slowly, staring at the fire. You wonder what she'd say if she could speak. Probably. You're welcome. That night the air inside the cottage is thick, damp, and borderline unbearable. But it's warm. The fire burns low. No one's shivering. Even the cow sighs contentedly. You curl up on your mat, a goat beside your feet, your hair smelling faintly of smoke, milk, and things best left unnamed. You close your eyes and try to remember what fresh air feels like, and then you sleep. Warm. You wake up gagging on air so thick it could be eaten with a spoon. It's not just warm anymore, it's humid, muggy, like someone boiled a stew made of cow breath, goat sweat, and damp wool, and left it simmering overnight. The windows are fogged up, slick with condensation. Every surface feels soft and slightly sticky. Your blanket smells like a livestock spa that hasn't been cleaned since Advent. You try to sit up and immediately knock heads with the goat, who has somehow migrated closer during the night and now looks personally offended by your movement. The cow, bless her, is still asleep, though her sleep consists of lying there motionless, staring at nothing, blinking so slowly it's unsettling. Her massive body radiates heat like a living stove, and honestly, you kind of hate her for it. But also love her. You're not sure anymore. You've passed. The threshold where human-animal boundaries are meaningful. It's just warm things in a box now. Elsbeth's already up. Of course. She's by the hearth, ladling something into a bowl and muttering about mould. "It's too warm," she says grimly, handing you a bowl of greyish porridge. Everything's starting to sweat, even the walls. You notice it too, the way the straw along the baseboards is damp, the sour smell creeping into the cracks, the way your shirt clings to your back. Congratulations. You've reached the part of the winter no one tells you about, the thaw. Not the glorious sunlit thaw of spring. No, this is the internal thaw, the mini-monsoon that happens when too many bodies, too much fire, too little ventilation, and one extremely smug cow conspire to create a climate zone best described as barn sauna. The kind that breeds mildew, coughs, and moods that sour faster than cream in a summer bucket. You open the door for just a moment, just long enough to let in some crisp air. You barely crack it before a wall of cold slaps you in the face like a judgmental god. Godric hisses from his blanket. Marta whimpers. The goat sneezes. You close the door again, humbled. You're trapped in your own microclimate, and the moisture is rising. Here's your historical tidbit for the day. One of the great ironies of winter survival in medieval Europe was that warmth often led to illness. Not cold, not frostbite, but warmth. Or rather, poor indoor air circulation combined with body heat, animal presence, and constant exposure to smoke from low-quality fuel. People weren't freezing to death so much as they were suffocating slowly in their own biological stew. Respiratory infections, coughs, flus, consumption, what they called tuberculosis, flourished in these cosy, humid spaces. Mould grew on walls, on bedding, even on people if they weren't careful. In many villages, the arrival of warmth wasn't cause for celebration. It was when the wet deaths began. You start noticing it around noon. Godric starts coughing. Just once at first, but then again, and again. Dry. Persistent. Elsbeth throws a glance his way, not panicked, but not casual either. She pulls out a cloth and tosses it to him. "Don't breathe on your sister," she says flatly. Marta is pale today. More than usual. She's quiet, curled near the hearth, her lips slightly parted. Her breath rattles just enough to make your stomach tighten. Elsbeth makes her a tea from dried thyme and crushed dried turnip greens. The smell is sharp and sour. Marta doesn't drink it. She just stares at it, eyes half-lidded. You try not to spiral. But it's impossible not to remember that sickness kills more people in winter than cold does. And it starts just like this. A rattle, a skipped meal, a child too quiet. In a panic you don't speak aloud, you offer to go for more herbs. Elsbeth shakes her head. There's nothing better. If the fever comes, we'll know. She says it like a weather report, as if the fever is a storm that either passes or doesn't. You spend the afternoon wiping down the walls with a rag dipped in vinegar and snow. It's not effective, but it feels like doing something. The walls drip. The fire crackles with more annoyance than heat. You open the shutters once more to vent the air, and the room gasps like a person who's been underwater too long. Then the temperature drops instantly, and you slam them shut again. There's a fringe practice from the time period worth mentioning here. In some villages, families would dig shallow breath holes in the ground under their huts, narrow tubes that allowed warm, stale air to escape out and draw in cold air from above. It didn't work well, but it was a primitive form of ventilation. In Hrothford, no one's dug a breath hole. You just have to hope the smoke goes up the chimney, and that the cow doesn't suffocate you in your sleep. By evening, Marta eats a few bites of porridge, no more than that, but it's something. Elsbeth rubs her back with oil made from boiled chicken fat and old herbs. The smell is heavy. The goat stays close. Godric's cough has faded, though his cheeks are flushed. He's sweating through his tunic. Elsbeth loosens it, but keeps his blanket tight. "Don't chill him now," she says when you try to open the window again. You nod. You're starting to understand the balance. Not too cold, not too warm. Not too wet, not too dry. A line so fine it might as well be imaginary. You lie down in the corner that smells least like mildew. The cow shifts again. You hear her tail slap something. The goat sighs like an old man. Outside, the snow continues to fall, steady and unbothered. You stare at the ceiling, watching a drip form on the beam above your head. It grows slowly, then falls onto your forehead with pinpoint precision. You wipe it away, then pull your cloak tighter. The air is thick, the heat is dangerous, but the fire is still burning, and for now everyone is still breathing. The funeral is quiet, not solemn, not grand, just quiet, like everything else that happens in Rothford when the temperature falls too low for grief to raise its voice. No black veils, no heavy hymns, just the sound of snow crunching beneath feet and a few muttered prayers that evaporate before they can reach the sky. You stand near the back, wrapped in every layer you own, breath sharp in your lungs. The entire village is here, heads bowed, steam rising from a small crowd of human bodies huddled like sheep around a shallow grave. The boy's name was Alric, 6 years old, thin, quiet. You remember him from the frost fair, sliding clumsily across the ice, smiling like he had something to prove. Now his mother clutches a bundle of cloth so tightly you're not sure if she knows he's gone. It's not even a proper coffin, just linen swaddling and a piece of oiled leather bound around the body with cord. No one can afford to. Waste good wood on the dead. The priest says a few words, nothing grand. No talk of eternal glory or golden fields. Just, he was here, now he is not. May the next world be kinder. And that's it. No one cries. Not in the way you'd expect. A few sniffles. Elsbeth wipes at her eye once. A man coughs and turns away. There's no screaming, no wailing. You realise that here, grief is quiet because everything is quiet. The cold eats sound, and the people don't have the strength to give it more. This isn't a tragic exception. This is a fact of winter. Death comes with the frost. Later you ask Elsbeth what happened. She shrugs, as if she can't afford to get too attached to the answer. Fever, maybe, or just the cold. Maybe both. Maybe nothing. She looks you in the eye. Sometimes they just stop. That evening the family doesn't return to their home. They're staying in the church, near the hearth. No one questions it. In Rothford, grief earns you fire, just for a night. You help Elsbeth make a soup to send over, mostly cabbage water with a scrap of dried fish. It's all you have. Godric helps by not arguing when you give him the last crust of bread to carry with it. You're not sure if it's mercy or strategy, but Elsbeth insists on sending it hot. Back in the cottage, Marta sits with her legs tucked under her, silent. She hasn't spoken much since the funeral. Not about the boy, not about the church, just nothing. She's watching the cow, who now seems to understand her role in this family has shifted from heat source to emotional support. Here's your historical insight for the night. Child mortality in medieval Europe was brutal. In some regions, up to 30% of children died before the age of 5. Winters were especially cruel. Illness, starvation, exposure. Take your pick. Cemeteries in cold climates show seasonal patterns. Rows of smaller graves, more concentrated during harsh winters. And because there wasn't space or fuel for long rituals, burial was often immediate. Fast, cold, quiet. There's a scholarly debate about how medieval people processed grief, especially in communities where death was constant. Did they become numb to it? Hardened? Or was their grief simply expressed differently? Quieter, deeper, more private? Some letters and journal entries from monks and nobles speak of overwhelming sorrow. But for peasants, there's less record, fewer written words. Their grief is buried in the ground alongside their dead. And then there are the fringe beliefs, like the one whispered about the White Knight. In some northern villages, people believed that if a child died in midwinter, their soul might linger until the first thaw. So, families would hang a token in the rafters, usually a ribbon or a doll, or a bit of cloth from the child's blanket, to keep the spirit close until the road opened again. Some believed that on the first warm night, the spirit would walk out with the snowmelt, unseen but heard in the drip-drip of eaves. You spot something like that later. In the corner of the boy's home, now cold and empty, you see a piece of red string tied to the highest beam. Frayed, faded, still there. That night the wind shifts. The sky is clear, stars spread like salt across black velvet. The moon is brutal, full and sharp. You lie in your corner, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, the cow breathing heavily beside you, the goat twitching in sleep. Elsbeth is already dozing, head tilted back against the wall. Godric, wrapped in 2 cloaks, mutters something in his sleep. Maybe the boy's name. Maybe not. You're not warm. Not really. But the fire is steady. The cow is alive. Everyone in this house is still breathing. You hear one soft sound from Marta. Not a word, not a sentence, just the sigh of a child who's not ready to cry, but doesn't want to forget. You close your eyes and try not to dream about frost on little fingers. You're collecting dung again. Because of course you are. That's your life now. Frozen fields, numb fingers, and cow droppings so dry they clink like pottery when you toss them into the basket. The air is brittle, the sky washed in that pale, wintry blue that tricks your eyes into thinking it's warm just because the sun is finally visible. It's not. Your breath still curls like smoke from a snuffed candle, and your boots crunch over frost-bitten earth that sounds hollow underfoot. Everything is still. Too still. Elspeth's instructions were clear. Don't bring back anything green, nothing fresh, and for the love of St. Hildegard, make sure it's dry. No one wants a wet fire. You nod, even though you've heard this speech twice a week for the past month. Godric mutters something under his breath about green dung being better than no dung, but he knows better than to say it too loud. You work together in silence. The field behind the village is pocked with the frozen remains of what once lived. Withered grasses, hoof prints from animals long slaughtered or hidden in barns, bits of broken cartwheels half buried in the snow. You dig with a flat wooden tool, not unlike a spatula for giants, scraping the ground to loosen the hard-packed bricks of animal waste. It's the kind of job that would break you if you thought about it too much, so you don't. Instead, you think about the fire back home, the tiny comfort it offers. You think about how long the last brick burned. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30, if you squinted and pretended the warmth was in your imagination all along. The math of medieval fuel is grim. One full day needs at least 6 bricks, maybe 8 if the wind is sharp. You're not even halfway there. Elspeth has promised to barter for more from the far end of the village, but the other families are getting stingy. Winter's dragging on longer than usual, and the supply's drying up. You've seen the looks people give each other at this, well, calculated, tired, suspicious. Everyone wants to survive. No one wants to admit it's coming down to numbers, and numbers always mean someone doesn't make it. There's your historical breadcrumb. By late winter, medieval villages were locked in a silent countdown. The stores were low, the animals thinner, and the fuel, always the fuel, vanished faster than anyone could gather it. People rationed warmth like food, dividing fire time between rooms, rotating who sat closest. In many regions there's evidence that families slept in shifts so someone could tend the fire, because if it went out at 3 a.m, your chances of restarting it were slim. Godric stands, arms full of frozen fuel, and groans. "Do you ever wonder if they'll write songs about this?" he asks. You smirk. "Only if we die dramatically." He considers this. "Maybe I'll walk into the woods with a torch. Go out in glory." You raise an eyebrow. "With what torch?" He laughs, and the sound cuts through the cold like a spark. It's the first one you've heard in days. You both start heading back, baskets heavy, muscles sore. The cow's warmth has been a godsend, but it's not enough anymore. Even she's eating more, leaving less behind. You never thought you'd say this, but the cow is hoarding heat. Halfway back, you pass the house where Alric's family lived. The door is still closed, but a thin trail of smoke curls from the chimney. That means someone's inside. Maybe the priest, maybe no one, maybe just the fire still burning out of habit. Fringe fact, in some regions, it was believed that if a fire burned in a home where someone had died, their spirit could stay longer. So the flame had to be watched carefully, stoked to keep warmth, but not so much that it invited the dead to linger. Doors were cracked open at night to let the soul out, but if the fire stayed lit too long, it was said the soul might never leave. You walk a little faster after that. Back in the cottage, Elspeth accepts the dung like a queen accepting tribute. No ceremony, just expectation. She inspects each piece, nods once, and tosses them near the hearth to dry for the next batch. The current fire is down to embers. Godric tries to add a damp stick, but it hisses and sizzles. Elspeth scolds him. "You want the smoke gods to choke us all?" You warm your hands over the dying coals, staring into them like they might tell you the future. All they offer is flickers and crackles and a slow reminder that nothing lasts, not even fire. The house feels smaller today, not physically, just tighter, like the walls have pulled in closer, like the cow's sighs echo too loudly. Even the goat seems more sullen, pressing itself against the door as if hoping it might just dissolve through it and vanish into the snow. You eat supper in silence, a stew of boiled barley, herbs that might once have been cabbage, and a few flakes of something that might be meat or might be ambition. Elsbeth serves it with a single slice of stale rye, cracked at the edges like the floor. Marta doesn't eat much. She's improving, yes, but slow. Her eyes are clearer, her breath less ragged, but her hands are still cold. You wrap them in yours, trying to share what little warmth you've hoarded. She doesn't resist. Later, Godric reads aloud from a scrap of story he traded for last week. A torn corner from a larger parchment. Something about a knight who rides a bear into battle. The details are fuzzy, the ink is smudged. But you all sit there, listening, clinging to the rhythm of the words. It's not truth. It's not even useful. But it is warm. You're standing in a puddle, indoors, which is frankly offensive. The world outside is still an ironclad sheet of frost, but here, inside the supposedly sheltered cottage, the ground is turning to slush. Not all of it, just that treacherous little corner near the hearth where the straw floor's begun to rot and the snow tracked in by 100 frozen boots has started to thaw. It squishes when you step on it, like a secret waiting to ruin your day. The thaw is here, or at least it's pretending to be. Outside, the snow still covers everything like a secret no one wants to dig up. But during the day, the air softens, slightly. The sun lingers longer. The icicles on the eaves begin their slow, dramatic drip. You'd think this would bring joy, but it doesn't. It brings anxiety. Because now everything is wet. The walls, the ceiling, the clothes, the food stores, even your bones feel damp. The house smells like old sheep and composted regret. Mould has taken up residence in the rafters like it pays rent. The fire, bless its overworked soul, is doing its best, but it's now fighting moisture instead of cold. Every time Elsbeth adds fuel, the room fills with steam, then smoke, then a long wheezing cough from Godric, whose lungs are still catching up from last week's fever. This isn't warmth, it's rot. Elsbeth is in a mood today. Not angry, not sad, just wound tight, like a bowstring about to snap. She slams pots a little too hard, speaks in clipped sentences. You've seen this before. The thaw is triggering something old in her bones. A memory of other thaws, other losses. There's a superstition in Hrothford. The thaw takes more than the freeze ever could. People drop dead in early spring. Their bodies, used to stillness and slow cold, can't handle the shift. It's like being boiled alive after a season of ice. You open the door to air out the cottage and immediately regret it. The sun may be out, but the ground is a bog. Mud sucks at your boots with every step. Meltwater trickles from roofs, carving channels through the snow, pooling in places no one remembers were low until they become lakes. Chickens wander around in a state of confused dampness, feathers puffed, eyes glazed. A pig passes you, groaning like it's questioning every decision that brought it here. Godric follows you outside carrying a cracked bucket to scoop water from the path leading to the well. The bucket used to hold grain. Now it holds a mystery soup of snowmelt, ash and goat pea. It's unclear what he plans to do with it. You don't ask. Here's your historical context. Early spring was, without exaggeration, one of the most dangerous times to be alive in the medieval world. Food stores were lowest, illness peaked, flooding was common, and the roads, if you could call them that, turned into endless mud traps. Trade halted. Travel stopped. Villages became isolated not by snow but by sludge. It was called the Hunger Gap, that cursed limbo between when winter stores ran out and spring crops began to grow. For some, it lasted weeks. For others, it was the difference between life and not making it to Easter. You and Godric make your way to the edge of the village, where the stream has overrun its banks. It wasn't a big stream to begin with, but now it sprawls across the path like it owns the place. The small footbridge that crossed it, gone, or rather, melted into it. the planks bobbing like sad little boats. "I could jump it," Godric says, already judging the distance. "You absolutely could not," you reply. He tries anyway. He lands in mud up to his knees, lets out a yelp, and immediately regrets every life choice. You help him back out laughing, which earns you a solid splash of mud to the face. Fair. You trudge back to the house, wetter and worse for wear. Inside, Elsbeth is boiling something pungent on the hearth. Onion skins, dried herbs, maybe the sole of a sock. It smells like it could cure or kill depending on the dosage. Marta sits nearby, cheeks pink again, eyes brighter. She offers you a square of something sticky. Dried berry paste, tart and tough. You chew it like jerky. It's perfect. She's feeling better. That, at least, is a win. Elsbeth hangs damp cloaks by the fire. It only makes the room wetter. Steam rises from every surface. You scrape more mould from the corner and swear you hear it laugh. Everything smells of rot and rebirth. You don't know whether to burn the place down or plant something in it. Fringe fact of the day: some households in late winter would burn entire straw mattresses to dry out the house. It wasn't about comfort, it was about mould control. The straw was full of fleas, lice, moisture and despair. Burning it gave the family a day of cleaner air, and one fewer thing to sleep on. The gamble was often worth it. By evening the fire is sputtering. Not for lack of fuel, you've managed to stash a few precious bricks, but because even the fire seems tired. The cow breathes slowly in the corner, flicking her ears at unseen irritations. The goat tries to chew a damp curtain. You sit in the middle of the cottage watching drips fall from the ceiling in time with your heartbeat. You're not freezing. Not anymore. You're just soggy and sore and done, but you're here, and that counts. The bird is small, grey, unimpressive really, more fluff than feathers, barely big enough to be worth noticing. But there it is, perched on the half-thawed fence post just outside Elsbeth's cottage, blinking at you like it owns the place. You pause in the doorway, basket in hand, breath held. Not because it's rare, not because it's beautiful, but because it's the first thing with wings you've seen in months. And for some reason that feels monumental. It chirps, a single, sharp note. Then it flies away. Godric sees it too, standing behind you, and whispers, "Spring," like the word is a secret, or a curse, or both. You step outside together, letting the door swing half-closed behind you. The sun is higher now, clearer, warmer. The snow hasn't vanished, but it's broken. Patches of brown earth have started to reappear like memories creeping back after a long fever. The trees are still bare, but the air doesn't bite. It merely nudges. Elsbeth says nothing, but when she joins you on the threshold, she squints up at the sky, sniffs once, and says, "Soon." You don't ask what. You already know. Today's chore is digging out the latrine. Romantic, right? But it has to be done. Over the winter it's been buried in snow, the path to it treacherous and slippery. Most people have been improvising. Buckets, corners, that one scandalous spot behind the barn that everyone pretends not to know about. But now the ground is soft enough to dig again, which means it's time to deal with what winter left behind. You and Godric take turns breaking the ice-crusted soil with a shovel that's more rust than metal. It's heavy, awkward, and squeals like a cursed flute every time it bites into frozen mud. The smell is, well, you already know. But now it's blooming in the warmth, rich and terrible, a reminder that survival isn't clean, it's honest. Here's your final historical insight. Sanitation was one of the least glamorous parts of medieval life. Latrines were often simple pits covered by wooden planks or stone slabs, shared by multiple families, and rarely cleaned. In winter they froze, in spring they thawed. Overflow and disease were rampant. Some monasteries had clever drainage systems, but peasants? They had shovels and patience, and if they were lucky, a bit of privacy. There's a scholarly theory that spring fevers weren't just from mould or lingering coughs, but from contact with thawing waste, bacteria waking up after their long nap, typhoid, dysentery, all the classics. Spring was beautiful, yes, but it came with consequences. Back in the house, Marta is sweeping. Sweeping! It's almost ridiculous, but also beautiful. She's using a rag-wrapped broom to push aside the soggy remains of straw and dirt, creating order out of the filth. Her cheeks are flushed, not with fever but with movement. Her strength is back. Elsbeth watches her without smiling. Then she gets to work airing out blankets, hanging them across the doorway to catch sunlight. Even the cow gets ushered back outside, clomping into the yard with an expression of deep bovine betrayal. The goat follows voluntarily. Inside, the cottage breathes. You didn't realise how long it's held its breath until now. The smoke has cleared, the walls are drying, the mould has stopped spreading or at least gone dormant. Even the fire is burning cleaner. No more hissing and coughing, just a steady orange glow like it's finally found its rhythm. You sit near the hearth and notice something strange. You're not cold. Not just not freezing, but actually comfortable. A little too warm even. You pull off your outer cloak, then your scarf. You blink at yourself, almost suspiciously. Elsbeth laughs under her breath. You'll miss it when the flies come, she says. Outside, the village is stirring. People you haven't seen in weeks step cautiously from their homes, blinking like moles. Someone's patching a roof. Someone else is trying to scrub soot from their windows. There's more colour now. Not just browns and greys, but hints of blue, green, even red as clothes and banners re-emerge from their winter hiding spots. Godric runs off to see if the Frostfair ice is cracking yet. You let him go. He deserves it. You help Elsbeth sort through what's left of the food stores. Turnips shriveled like bad memories. Onions turned to mush. Dried peas clinging to their dignity. She makes a broth anyway. It tastes like endurance, like spring in a bowl. Fringe fact for your collection. In some parts of Europe, people mark the end of winter with a ritual burning of the house dirt. They'd sweep out their homes, collect the ash, mouldy rushes, dead vermin, whatever had accumulated over the long months, and burn it outside while chanting prayers to ward off illness. It wasn't just about cleaning, it was about resetting, spiritually and physically. A way to draw a line in the soot and say, enough, we survived. At dusk, the bird comes back, same post, same look, same single chirp, and this time, Marta chirps back. You all laugh. Just a little. Just enough. That night, no one needs the fire to fall asleep. It's still burning, sure, but it's not the centre anymore. Just a comfort, not a lifeline. The cow sleeps outside, the goat too, and no one shivers. You lie under your blanket, listening to the soft creak of the beams, the occasional drip from the roof, the shifting of the earth as it slowly wakes up. You made it. Through the hunger, the cold, the lice, the smoke, the mourning, the filth, the thaw, through peat bricks and cow breath and sleepless nights counting firewood, through the kind of quiet that could unmake a person. You made it. And when the fire finally dies down, you don't panic, you just turn over and sleep. So here you are, blinking in the pale morning light that slips through the cracks of a cottage no longer shivering. There's still a bite to the air. Don't get cocky. But it's a different kind of cold now. The kind that doesn't threaten to steal the breath from your lungs, just wakes you up a little too early. Elsbeth is already outside, sleeves rolled, hanging a blanket over a crooked line that's somehow still holding together after months of snow and steam and goat-related accidents. Marta skips, actually skips, between puddles. Godric throws a clump of half-thawed manure at a fence post, with the bored accuracy of a boy whose only remaining enemies are boredom and damp socks. You, meanwhile, are just standing there in the doorway watching, listening. Not because something dramatic is about to happen, no wolves, no sudden freezes, no collapsed roofs, but because nothing is happening, and that's rare enough to feel sacred. There's something strange about surviving. You expect a big fanfare, some reward, some official certificate of you did it. But there isn't one, just you, and your sore back, and a cottage that now smells slightly less like wet fur. Your fingers still bear the marks of 100 small burns from feeding a stubborn fire. Your boots are still stitched with hope and desperation. Your breath is still cautious. But your heart knows. You survived a medieval winter. You didn't freeze. You didn't starve. You learned to scrape dung like it was treasure. You learned that warmth is more than fire. It's closeness. It's the breath of animals in a shared room, the weight of extra blankets, the hand you don't let go of when the wind howls. You learned how firewood is never just firewood. It's time. It's labour. It's a future that burns bright, then smoulders, then flickers, and finally goes cold unless you fight for it every hour of the night. And you learned that medieval peasants didn't just survive, they adapted. They made fuel out of waste, they stole it, they bartered for it, they protected it like treasure. They burned dried moss, old shoes, straw mixed with mud and hope. They brought animals into their homes not just for warmth, but for life. They weren't just enduring the cold, they were constantly creatively pushing it back. There's something deeply human about that, something humbling, because even now, centuries later, you can still feel the echoes of that fight in the way you crave a blanket on a rainy day, or the way you curse your heater for clanking at 3 a.m. You come from a long gritty line of dung-burning survivors, and honestly, that's kind of beautiful. As you settle in for one last moment inside that cottage, the fire low, the light rising, the smell of something vaguely edible bubbling on the hearth, you breathe in and let yourself feel it, that long exhale of winter ending. You survived, and you'll never take central heating for granted again.